battle in the heart of Alabama caught our attention. Coal miners in one community, they've been on strike now for months.
Working as long as 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, in some of the most dangerous conditions.
I really think that the labor movement is the single greatest force for democracy in the history of the United States.
The story of Alabama is a story of not just resilience, but of militancy.
I say no contract, you say no code. No contract, no contract.
If we ain't all free, ain't none of us free.
You're listening to Alabama's only union talk radio show, The Valley Labor Report, with Adam Keller and Jacob Morrison.
Hello, Tennessee Valley. This is the Valley Labor Report. My name is Jacob Morrison, here with my co-host and fellow agitator Adam Keller, and we are broadcasting live online and on the radio from the heart of the Tennessee Valley, the Spice Radio Studio in Huntsville, Alabama. Today, Alabama conservatives want children to go back to work. We also talked to Jennifer Sherer about state labor policy across the country. The UAW's Shawn Fain endorsed Joe Biden. We're going to be talking about and reacting to that, all that and more on today's program. If you want to be part of the show today, we've got a phone number. The line will be open in the second half of the program, in overtime. So get that number ready. 844-899-TVLR is the number. 844-899-8857. You can also leave us a voicemail throughout the week, and we might respond to it on the next program. If you haven't gotten enough of us by the time that we wrap up here on the radio, or if you just want to see what we're up to throughout the week, you can find us anywhere you find anything online at The Valley Labor Report. We're on Twitter, Facebook, wherever you get your podcasts, TikTok, all at The Valley Labor Report. We also have written content on our website, TVLR.fm. You can sign up for our newsletters there. Just a reminder, your support helps us stay on the air. We could not do it without our sponsors and donors. If you want to make a one-time or recurring donation to the project, you can do that at our website as well, tvlr.fm/donate. You can also buy our merch or become a patron at patreon.com/The Valley Labor Report. And finally, if you're a member of a union, then please do think about getting your local to sponsor the show, because we could not do it without the support of organized labor.
That's right. And let me add a disclaimer that any viewpoints or opinions expressed in this program belong solely to their author and do not necessarily represent any organization or sponsor. We welcome all of our listeners, whether you're on YouTube, Facebook, Unclaimed Mysteries Internet Radio, WVNN, WZZA, WHIV, or through your favorite podcast app. We are proud to be part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network and encourage our listeners to check that out. As most of you know, we are not media professionals, just some diehard union brothers who believe that Alabama and the South's labor movement and working class deserve a bigger platform. We're hoping this project can make a difference on that front, and we could not do it without you. So we want to thank everyone for tuning in. Whether you're a loyal fan or a first-time listener, we appreciate you spending some time with us this morning.
And we're going to jump right into last week in Southern labor, because we've got a lot of stuff on the program today, so we want to get to it, as much of it as possible. So without further ado, here is what workers in the U.S. South and the American colonies were up to on from January 20th to the 26th. In new campaigns, we've got 3 workers at Victory Toyota in Triadelphia, West Virginia, filing for a union election with the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Workers likely pushed by their employer filed a petition to decertify the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, IAMAW, as the union representing 18 workers at Rail Crew Express in Thayer, Missouri. The National Right to Work Foundation is supporting the decertification attempt. The employer filed a petition for a union election after a majority of the 20 workers at a Starbucks in New Orleans, Louisiana, demonstrated support for unionization with Starbucks Workers United. The International Union of Security, Police, and Fire Professionals of America, SPFPA, appears to be raiding a unit of 31 workers at Golden SVCS in Washington, D.C., who are currently represented by the Governed United Security Professionals. 14 workers at Rising for Justice filed a petition to expand their bargaining unit at Rising for Justice in Washington, D.C. 27 workers at Southeastern Paper Company in College Park, Georgia, filed a petition to hold a union election with the Teamsters, Local 528. 42 workers at Collins Landing Systems in Haltom City, Texas, filed a petition to hold a union election with the United Auto Workers, UAW. 7 workers at Leidos in Merritt Island, Florida, filed a petition to hold a union election with the Motion Picture and Video Laboratory Technicians, Allied Crafts, and Government Employees, Local 789, which is an IATSE affiliate. This petition was withdrawn in the same week. 97 workers at U.S. Sugar Savannah Refinery in Port Wentworth, Georgia, filed a petition to hold a union election with the Teamsters, Local 528. 74 workers at Lycée François de la Nouvelle Orleans, which is a free public charter school following both Louisiana state curriculum and French national curriculum in New Orleans, Louisiana. 74 workers there filed a petition to hold a union election with the United Teachers of New Orleans, an AFT affiliate. 15 workers at the San Antonio Report in San Antonio, Texas, filed a petition to hold a union election with the News Guild CWA's Media Guild of the West. In election results, the petition to hold a union election with the United Federation of LEOs among 20 security guards at Christus Health was withdrawn, as was the petition to hold a union election with the United Steelworkers, USW, among 3 workers at Valero in Memphis, Tennessee. The petition to hold a union election with the UAW Local 214 among 4 workers at the American Red Cross was withdrawn, as was the petition to decertify the Transport Workers Union, TWU, Local 513, as the representative of 21 workers at Menzies Aviation in Dallas, Texas, meaning the union remains. 66 security guards at Akima Global Services in Donna, Texas, voted unanimously in favor of unionization with the United Government Security Officers of America. 5 workers at Wells Fargo Bank in Daytona Beach, Florida, voted 4-1 in favor of unionization with the CWA. 11 workers at CMEX in New Braunfels, Texas, voted 9-1 in favor of unionization with the Teamsters, Local 657. 20 workers at Gallows Point Resort in St. John, Virgin Islands, voted 7-12 in favor of decertifying the Seafarers International Union of North America. 12 workers at Asplund Tree Expert in Lexington, Kentucky, voted 9-2 in favor of unionization with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, IBEW, Local 369. 3 workers at High Point Cannabis in St. Louis, Missouri, voted 0-2 against unionization with the United Food and Commercial Workers, UFCW, Local 655. 10 workers at MV Transportation in West Palm Beach, Florida, voted unanimously in favor of unionization with the Amalgamated Transit Union, ATU, Local 1577. 4 workers at MCOR Government Services in Alexandria, Virginia, voted unanimously in favor of unionization with the International Union of Operating Engineers, IUE, Local 99. 64 workers at Morton Salt in Cape Canaveral, Florida, voted 30-30 in their union election, and ties go to the employer, meaning the USW will not represent these workers at this time. 1,232 workers at Mangual's Office Cleaning Service in Ganaibo, Puerto Rico, voted 348-179 in favor of unionization with the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, Local 1996. And finally, 24 workers at Rainbow Blossom in Louisville, Kentucky, voted 13-2 in favor of unionization with the UFCW Local 227. In strikes and bargaining updates, after the merger between Microsoft and Activision has gone through, Microsoft is now laying off an astounding 1,900 workers in just the gaming department. Some in labor supported the merger, including the Communication Workers of America, which represents some game workers at Microsoft, though none that are affected by the layoffs. When the acquisition was completed in October, the CWA said this, quote, represents a milestone in the effort to improve working conditions in the video game industry, because of the neutrality agreement the company signed to garner the union's support for the merger. United Campus Workers CWA at Jacksonville State in Alabama are calling for a $15 an hour minimum wage by the end of 2024 and $17 an hour by the end of 2025. Workers there currently make as little as $8.25 an hour. The union went public last year and is wall-to-wall open to any employee. The American Federation of Musicians, AFM, are in negotiations with the Alliance of Motion Pictures and Television Studios, AMPTP, and held a rally last week to protest the lack of movement, and IATSE pledged their support. Contract expiration is fast approaching for Teamsters at Anheuser-Busch and without a contract. The union issued a warning to the company to sign a contract or face a nationwide strike and boycotts. The Teamsters are planning on another roundtable with Donald Trump next week, and controversy is bubbling up around this as it was revealed that O'Brien sent a memo to all General Executive Board members mandating that they attend the meeting after whispers of some protesting the meeting by not attending. Southern General Executive Board member John Palmer replied with a stern memo indicating that not only does he refuse to attend the meeting with Donald Trump, but Palmer argues that the meeting itself violates the Teamsters Constitution based on its prohibition on association with insurrectionists and could even be grounds for expulsion from the union of participants in the meeting. In politics and legislation, the CWA became the latest union to endorse a ceasefire in Gaza as the humane position is becoming more and more mainstream in the labor movement. The SEIU signed on to calls for a ceasefire in Gaza a few weeks ago. The Los Angeles Metro Board of Directors is set to approve a major contract worth $730 million to a Hyundai subsidiary. The UAW and other community groups are pressuring the board not to award the contract until Hyundai agrees to a nationwide community benefits agreement, particularly given Hyundai's recent history union busting and abusing children, immigrants, and prisoners. The UAW endorsed Joe Biden for president last week. The timing was unexpected on the part of many, but the move itself was not, particularly the timing being unexpected, particularly given the Biden administration's refusal to toe the union's line on a ceasefire in Gaza. Biden's staff even threatened elected UAW leaders with canceling his speech if these UAW leaders did not take off their UAW for a ceasefire pin. The UAW leader did not budge, proving the threat from the White House an empty one. In internal union affairs, the new Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers for union membership are out, and union density declined yet again, falling from 10.1 to 10.0%, dangerously close to single-digit unionization rates. This is not because unions lost members, though. On the contrary, there were 139,000 new union members in 2023, but non-union job growth outpaced these numbers. Nationwide, the trend was for union density to fall in union strongholds like the North and the West and increase in more anti-union areas like the South. This includes Alabama, which saw an increase in both union membership and union density for the second year in a row. And finally, we have heard reports of the Alabama Education Association raiding both the Birmingham and Central Alabama American Federation for Teachers locals. We will hopefully have more to report on this next week, but just a reminder that the AEA is very explicit that they are not a union and so therefore are not subject to any of the pleasantries that the AFL-CIO unions might award some within the House of Labor. And with that, we're going to go ahead and head to a break. We're going to be right back with Jennifer Sherer talking about state labor policies across the country. Really excited for this conversation. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Benefit Architects has proudly supported union members and union-made products for over 35 years. If you are a federal employee and an AFGE member, you're eligible for hundreds of dollars in money-saving benefits, including group life insurance, dental insurance, and AFLAC insurance. Additionally, if you're a union member but don't work for the federal government, you can still qualify for several of these money-saving policies. So give Tate Cure a call at 256-215-6769 for details and to enroll. Again, that is Tate Cure at 256-215-6769.
In Alabama, more than 200,000 of our friends and family members are living without health care coverage. Often folks can't stay healthy enough even to keep their jobs. We can fix this. It's time for us to find a way to close the health care coverage gap so that people can remain at work. Let's make this a priority. Let's close this gap and cover Alabama. To learn more and how you can help, visit coveralabama.org.
The attorneys at Maples, Tucker & Jacobs have stood with the working people of Alabama for over 40 years, providing skilled legal representation for your workplace injury claims. When you are injured on the job, it can be a scary time. The attorneys at Maples, Tucker & Jacobs have the experience to guide you through the process to make sure that you and your family are properly taken care of and your rights are protected. If you need help, call the attorneys at Maples, Tucker & Jacobs at 855-617-9333 or visit online at www.mtnj.com. No representation is made that the quality of legal services provided is greater than the quality of legal services provided by other law firms.
Support for the Valley Labor Report comes from the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers Union. Learn more by visiting www.ifpte.org.
Attention union members, membership organizations, podcasters, or anyone with a payment processing need. The future is here, and your organization needs to be prepared by working with Unionly. With Unionly, your union or organization can take payments on a mobile device, eliminating processing fees, giving you a better price than other payment processing methods, while at the same time supporting a union-friendly business with a specialized skill set to meet your needs. Your members will thank you when they pay their dues at their convenience without waiting in line to deposit cash or check. Start preparing for the future today by calling 206-595-8631 or visiting unionly.io.
Are you looking for a better future, a career that can have you set for life, and to be a part of something that's bigger than yourself? If you are, then consider a skilled trades apprenticeship with the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades. The work of IUPAT is all around us, from the industrial painters who work on the bridges to drywall finishers, floor coverers, the glazers who install the glass in our skylines, and so much more. With an IUPAT apprenticeship, you earn while you learn and receive benefits while learning the trade, including a pension. We provide world-class education free of charge. That's right, no student debt. Our starting salaries for apprentices that graduate is above the national median salary with benefits for entire families. And you have the flexibility to take your trade wherever you'd like in the country to work. IUPAT District Council 77 covers our entire region, so give Adam Booth a call at 205-603-3142 for more information. Again, that phone number is 205-603-3142. Come build a better future with us today and join IUPAT.
I'm attorney Tommy Sinyard. When you've been injured and need help, you need a lawyer who's with you.
Sinyard Law. You need attorneys always available to take care of you. Sinyard Law.
And keep you in the loop. It's your case. You need to know what's happening.
Sinyard Law. And never a charge to meet with us to evaluate your case. Sinyard Law.
A new firm, but an old name. One that will stay with you every step of the way.
Sinyard Law, the name with proven results.
Support for this program is provided by the International Association for Machinists and Aerospace Workers, Local Lodge 44 in Decatur, Alabama. Learn more at iamaw44.org.
Come on, you poor workers, good news to you I'll tell, how the good old union has come in here to dwell.
Labor creates all wealth. All wealth should go to labor, and you're listening to the Valley Labor Report. My name is Jacob Morrison here with Adam Keller. We have a great guest coming on the show now. She is the director of the State Worker Power Initiative at the Economic Policy Institute and the Economic Analysis and Research Network. She is a member of the IFPTE Local 70 non nonprofit employees union. Jennifer Sherer, welcome to the Valley Labor Report. Thanks for the time this morning.
Morning. Great to see you guys.
Great to see you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. So Jacob gave you a little bit of an introduction, but if you could just sort of tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got involved in the movement and what led you up to this current position you're in right now.
Okay, sure. So I've been at Economic Policy Institute for about 3 years now, and came there to work on, as you said, the State Worker Power Initiative, which is really EPI's commitment to supporting a group of state and local organizations around the country that has been part for over 20 years of what we call our EARN network, Economic Analysis and Research Network. So I think, as some folks might know already, Economic Policy Institute is a longstanding, founded in the 1980s, nonpartisan nonprofit think tank committed to focusing on working people's issues. And looking at economic conditions and policy choices that affect low and middle income workers, particularly. And we support this network of state and local organizations around the country that are also doing that in partnership with labor and grassroots organizations in their home states. And part of EPI's commitment to focusing even more than we have in the past on some of those state policy questions is the recognition that state policies, just as much, and in some cases, depending on where you live in the country, might shape your economic outcomes just as much as what's happening in Congress or at the federal level, and particularly at moments like right now in our history, where there's a lot of gridlock and roadblocks to Congress reforming things like our federal labor law. States have an incredibly huge role to play in shaping outcomes for workers. So that's what I focus on. And before coming to EPI, I was director of the Labor Center at University of Iowa. I've been a labor educator for most of my career, doing worker education and working with a long list of different unions on building up their leadership development programs and worker rights education. So in Iowa primarily, but in partnership with a lot of unions in the Midwest.
And you had some experience with UE, right?
Yeah, I guess you asked me to go sort of all the way back. My first opportunity to be part of a union was all the way back in grad school, when I transferred kind of in the degree to University of Iowa and became a teaching assistant. The grad employees had just had their union election, so I was involved very early on in sort of the formation of that bargaining unit in the late 1990s, and got to be part of some of the bargaining committees, was the local president and vice president, did a lot of door knocking and membership building in those early years of building up a new union. So that was some of my first union experience. Also worked on some organizing campaigns with that UE was heading up at the time. And that was a great way to enter the labor movement in the late 90s, and also sort of the height of the global justice movement, which I also had a lot of opportunities to be part of for several years into the early 2000s.
That's awesome. Yeah, we're big fans of UE here on the Valley Labor Report. And also something that your story really, brings up for me that I think gets into what we're going to talk about today with union membership numbers and union growth, is the experience of organizing at the grad level or as a grad student, or organizing on college campuses more broadly. And that seems to be a major trend over the past few years, this, energy on college campuses with various levels of workers, right? From the professors to the grad students to, the hourly employees on campus. And one thing that we are wondering is how much is that going to boost the movement long term, right? Are these folks going to be organizing on college campuses and then, much like you, that lead them down a path of organizing and unionizing in other sectors and other industries? And I'm just curious if, like, have y'all done any research on that, or what are the trends y'all are seeing, and do you agree with that assessment that there could be some long-term gains that we're going to see out of this kind of organizing?
Oh yeah, for sure. There's from my generation of folks, there's certainly a whole cadre of people who were leaders of grad employee unions in the 90s who went into various parts of the labor movement, as organizers or researchers or labor educators, which ended up being my path. And I think what the numbers tell us from the last couple of years, that just incredible explosion and success, just astounding, jaw-dropping election victories on campuses across the country the last few years, means that for this generation of folks who are coming through grad programs right now, that the numbers of people who are having the ability to experience not just being part of a union, but forming a new union, right? I mean, that is life-changing for people who are at the heart of it. And you take that experience with you, whether folks go into academia, and have a new understanding and a new ability to be part of, or to grow faculty unions. Faculty are far less on a percentage basis, unionized than grad employees at this point in our country. And or if folks go into other careers, because we know that part of what's driving the organizing is folks' recognition that there's just a crisis in the academic labor market, and a lot of people won't end up in faculty positions. They'll end up in other roles and other careers, but you carry that experience with you. And knowing how to form a union or take a leadership role in a union anywhere you go is something that is going to be transformative, I think, in a lot of sectors potentially.
Right. Yeah, I really agree. I think there's just so much potential there with, leadership development, because I agree, like, it is a life-changing experience, the relationship building, the feelings of solidarity and collective action, that you really do feel. It's more than just like something you read about or you study. It becomes a lived experience, and I really do hope to see how that, I can't wait to see how that really trickles out into the broader economy. So, we talked a little bit about the numbers. Let's talk about it. The BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, put out the new union membership data for the year. Jacob mentioned some of the highlights in our last week in Southern Labor Report. There is growth, but not fast enough to keep up with population. So density did drop slightly from 10.1 to 10.0. In Alabama, it's a little bit brighter story. We continued to grow. It went from 7.2 to 7.5 union density. And just to remind folks, union density is the percentage of the employees who are union members, right? So 7.5% of workers in Alabama are union members, according to this report. So, Jennifer, I know you study these numbers closely. What are some of your takeaways and reactions to this?
Yeah, and I'll just say, one thing right off the bat for anybody who's looking at the EPI analysis of the numbers is that our report looks more at the representation numbers. So that's, where when BLS asks people, not just are you a member of a union, but are you covered by a union contract? And we do that because, part of what we're trying to assess is what's the overall economic impact. So the union density, if you look at representation, like who's covered by a union contract, is a tiny bit higher than the membership number that you cited, because there are always more folks who are covered by a union contract than our members. So if people are noticing a discrepancy, that's why. So one thing that really sticks out, to go back to the conversation that you started about young people organizing these days, is that the increase in overall, the growth in numbers of union members is being totally driven by young workers right now, right? So unionization among workers under age 45 grew by about 230,000 last year. Which is pretty phenomenal given the obstacles and the stacked deck that workers of any age continue to face when they're organizing.
Right.
And the other
because,
thing,
and I was just going to say, like, when I think about young workers, a lot of times we're talking service industry jobs, right? You know, some of the highest profile campaigns would be Starbucks and REI and Trader Joe's, right? Where there's vicious union busting happening. So I think that is very, you know, noteworthy to see that gain among young workers.
and you know, there's the data don't kind of break down for us in terms of where are folks coming from, and so you know, we know there's a mix behind that, but it's really interesting to see those demographics begin to shift. And I think the other thing that kind of pops out in the data from last year is that workers of color are also driving the segments and when you break down the demographics, it's the increases are being driven by young workers and workers of color. I think that's something you can see really clearly.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, you know, we've seen the popularity polls come out, and some of the numbers I've seen is that 88% of young folks, people under 30, approve of labor unions, which is, you know, that's remarkable. I don't know that video games and pizza would poll that high with people under 30. Like 88% is huge. But obviously there's this disconnect between people's approval of unions, people's desire to join unions, and their ability to join unions. And so you mentioned that the obstacles that folks are facing. And could you talk a little bit more about how is the system not set up well to organize?
Yeah, I mean, so for private sector workers, trying to go through the various hurdles to get to a union contract, our federal law says on paper that our country is committed to a policy of promoting collective bargaining. In reality, the law that we have has been both amended pretty heavily in the mid-20th century and eroded by a series of court decisions and board decisions over the decades that have stacked the deck pretty unfairly against workers. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that it's impossible to organize. Workers are doing it and succeeding all over our country in pretty much every sector today. But employers have a huge advantage in the sense that the law does not penalize their hostility toward workers' right to form a union. So, you know, typically when workers start the process of organizing, as a lot of your listeners know, you know, employers do everything that they can think of to try to impede that process. That might be trying to scare people, trying to threaten people, having one-on-one meetings with them. We call those captive audience meetings. In some cases, crossing the line into illegal behavior that includes firing people who are leading the organizing efforts. And a lot of employers are comfortable doing any and all of those things because they know that the consequences for doing them are minimal to none, right? So the most that the labor board is typically able to do with the tools at their disposal, if workers then go through the long, painful process of filing board charges about illegal employer behavior, is that the employer is going to get a notice saying you need to stop this behavior. If they fired somebody or somebody lost wages or something of economic consequence, the employer is told that they got to pay the back wages and restore what was lost. But for most employers, they're doing in terms of maintaining their position of unequal power in a particular workplace, they consider that a cost of doing business, right? And to them, probably not a very steep cost of doing business. So our law is incredibly weak, puts a lot of obstacles in workers' way. And I think the other thing that is actually pretty phenomenal about the 2023 BLS statistics is that we're seeing any increase at all, measurable at this point, in the private sector union numbers means that workers are being very persistent in their organizing efforts in spite of all those odds. The other thing that's...
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say the other thing that's a reality about the data is that the data don't fully pick up or account for, organizing efforts that are in process, or workers that have even won their union election but don't have a contract yet. A lot of those things are not going to show up yet in the numbers.
That's true. Absolutely. Right. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that about the uneven playing field, and all this is incredibly true, and especially in a place like Alabama. And what's really kind of interesting about the numbers is that in the places where there is more support for unions, and I think in particular in Michigan, where it was the site of it was really kind of a center of the UAW strike. They just repealed right to work. They reinstituted prevailing wages. There was a lot of movement in Michigan, and they lost union density, and I think they actually lost numerically numbers of members. And in the public sector, where generally it's kind of easier to organize than in the private sector, particularly at the federal level right now, the public sector lost members, whereas, like you said, kind of astoundingly, there was, a reasonable increase in private sector union membership. And, so the trend seemed to be in places where it's easier to organize, there was less organization. And then in places where it's more difficult to organize, there was more organization, like public sector falling, private sector increasing, Michigan falling, Alabama increasing. What do you make of that?
So I would love to talk about the public sector, because that is a complicated story that I think we don't have a real clear, coherent national story about, because it differs so much state by state. Right. So one thing that you just said that's absolutely true is that at the federal level, if we just pull out only public employees in federal government jobs, we see an uptick, actually, an increase in union membership last year. However, the vast majority of folks working in public service are in state and local governments. So that's everybody from state employees to school employees, teachers, probably being numerically the largest among occupations in public service. And on a state-by-state basis, the laws under which public employees at the state and local government level work vary wildly, just totally different. So we have states still in the country where there's an outright ban on having a union contract for state and local government workers. So we have to keep that in mind. And then we have, some states that have very robust, long-standing, protective union laws for state and local government employees. And what I think is really clear when we look at the state and local government unionization rates, which did fall last year, that's where we're seeing the decreases. If you pulled out the public sector, we noted it's kind of remarkable. Private sector union membership went up last year, but we are seeing losses in state and local government unionization levels across the country. And that has to do with both the ongoing, very unrelenting attack on union rights at the state level in at least a dozen states in the country, right? So if you are a teacher in Florida right now, you are very much feeling like the ability to even hold on to the union you already have is under assault, because the state legislature each year has, proposed, and this past year continued to enact more and more policies that make it difficult for state and local government employees to unionize. And we're seeing that all over the country. So, you mentioned Michigan as an example, right? Michigan is one of the states, along with Wisconsin, Florida. I mean, there's just a long list where since 2010, state legislatures and governors have, in many cases, targeted public employee unions with policies that make it more difficult for people to unionize. So when you look at Michigan, and even though some of their state laws very significantly began to change last year, though the effects of that over a decade of attacks, I think people are still living with there. And Michigan did repeal its right to work law last March, but that has not yet gone into effect. In fact, the repeal goes into effect next month in February. So just to say, the impact of the policies now being reversed, many of those anti-union state policies being reversed in Michigan, will still take some time to take hold. Would be one thing that I think it's worth noting. But I think the assault on public employee unions at the state and local level deserves much more attention from the labor movement generally. And that, the national story of an uptick in strikes and an uptick in interest in petitioning for union elections across the country is absolutely real. And what is also real at the same time is that in many, many states across the country, longstanding public employee unions are under assault. I lived in Iowa for a long time, and that is absolutely the story of my state as well. Not long after Scott Walker passed Act 10 in Wisconsin, our state legislature, once it became a majority Republican after 2016, one of the first things they prioritized was demolishing what had been a very long-standing Public Employee Relations Act. And so public employee unions have suffered really stark impacts from that. Many people losing most parts of their contracts and, having to come up with all kinds of new measures just to keep their unions alive since 2017.
Right.
So,
yeah, absolutely. They're so embattled, particularly in Florida. And I think that I'm really glad you brought that up. It can't be brought up enough about what's happening there in Florida. I mean, and certainly in the state of Alabama, where public sector workers don't have any collective bargaining anywhere in our state, I think it is something that, to your point, the labor movement has to take seriously, that there are workers working in local and state government who want to organize, who want contracts. And so I really appreciate the work that EPI does on state policy and the emphasis on state level policies and local policies as well. So we wanted to kind of switch gears and talk about the state policies. And I know you could give us some examples of like states that are doing better in terms of supporting organizing, and of course the states like Florida that are making it harder. But the one issue that is just continuing to come up in Alabama and elsewhere, in Iowa as well, is child labor. And so we wanted to mention child labor because we have this group in Alabama called the Alabama Policy Institute that receives, Koch brother money, and they are now pushing legislation to remove barriers for minors to go to work. And Jacob, you can chime in more with some of the details of this, but we wanted to talk about the child labor trends because that is something, that just boggles my mind that in 2024, our labor movement is having to fight back against child labor. But, you study state policy and you see what's happening across the country. I assume that Alabama's not alone in these proposals to loosen child labor laws, right?
Yeah, and thank you for telling me about Alabama Policy Institute because I'll have to look that one up. But
they're
definitely
bad.
Not alone.
They're real bad.
Okay, so we have been tracking state attacks on child labor laws for the last year now. And Alabama is not alone in that regard. So we've got over 22 states, I believe, at this point, where we've seen proposals just in the last 2 to 3 years to weaken child labor laws at the state level. So this is a very coordinated, multi-industry push across the country with sometimes very clearly stated long-range goal of rolling back federal standards eventually for the whole country. So, this is sort of some of the same industry groups that ever since the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act was passed, that's the law that put in place minimum wage, overtime, and child labor protections for the first time in our history, has had a goal of wiping out those standards. So those groups that are pushing the measures at the rollbacks at the state level often include state chapters of the National Restaurant Association, state chambers of commerce, National Federation of Independent Business, their state chapters. But then there's also, a lot of influence from some billionaire-backed sort of dark money groups. There's a think tank called Foundation for Government Accountability that is Florida-based, but that has been very instrumental in writing many of the child labor bills that have been introduced in states the last few years, and coordinating their passage in state legislatures where they have a lot of influence, along with sort of the more familiar Koch-backed groups like Americans for Prosperity and others.
Right.
Well, I was just going to jump in and say that the range of these proposals have kind of varied. There's been some, just really extreme stuff. There was one recently, having difficulty remembering the state, but that proposed to allow children to work 8 hours on a school night and 40 hours in a school week. And it's, that's kind of bizarre. There have been some to even allow 14-year-olds in the coal mines, and it's amazing that there's even anybody willing to put their names to something like that. It's a little bit less extreme what the Alabama Policy Institute is proposing here in Alabama, but it's still pretty extreme. What they want to do is they want to remove the requirement for schools to sign off on 14 and 15-year-olds being able to work. Right now in Alabama, there's a requirement for schools to say, like, yay, verily, this 14-year-old is doing good in school, and so, we sign off on them having, a small little part-time job or whatever. And so they're couching it in this language of, like, parents' rights, and parents should be able to determine, not the state, how good their kid is doing in school. And it's like, I don't know. It's pretty kind of objective measurements, you can see, you can just see if the kid is doing well in school. Are they making A's and B's, or are they making, C's and D's and F's, right? If they're the latter, then they probably shouldn't be working after school. They should probably be studying. And I'm interested in if you have found any tension in the among the conservative bloc while this is being pushed, because I think the obvious thing is that the beneficiary of all of these new loosening of child labor laws are going to be like poultry plants utilizing undocumented children to undercut, the wages of immigrant and documented immigrant and then native born kind of American wages in like poultry plants and stuff, or the farms, or things like this. It's not, we're not looking at WASPs going and working in the fields because of this legislation. Is there any at all recognition of the tension there between the anti-immigrant rhetoric coming from the right and then also this almost explicit permission to exploit immigrants?
Yeah, I think the starting point for this discussion that we sometimes skip over is that we've never eradicated exploitative forms of child labor in the U.S., despite maybe what lots of us would like to think. We have hundreds of thousands of children working in our agricultural sector, in some cases completely legally, because we have a double standard in our federal and most state labor laws that allows children, in some cases as young as 10 or 12, to work in highly hazardous agricultural occupations. And even though our child labor laws have been very important and effective to some extent at doing what we developed a consensus about 100 years ago that we wanted to do as a country, which is try to ensure some measure of equal opportunity and equal access to public education for most children. Those laws are uneven across the country, and they have never been updated since 1938 at the federal level. So, when you mention that it sounds kind of shocking that there are some states that now are changing what had been pretty long-standing kind of guardrails around how many hours per week should a student who's still in high school be working, or how late into the night, can you assign a 16-year-old to work an overnight shift? Well, the reality, when you start looking into what our state law landscape is that actually there are states all over the country that never set those guardrails. And so part of what we're seeing in terms of this national coordinated effort to wipe out a lot of existing child labor standards is that they've done a really careful analysis, frankly. I hand it to them. They've done a really careful analysis of which states have filled some of the gaps that are in our federal law. So if Alabama's got a work permit system, they're going after that work permit system and trying to eradicate it because they know that's one of the things that's not covered in federal law. So the attacks look different in every state because the industry groups that are trying to roll back the standards are trying to clear the decks and sort of wipe out anything that states have done proactively to go above and beyond the very weak floor that our federal law sets for protecting children and making sure that they can get access to a good education, regardless of what their economic background is, or regardless of their immigration status. Right. And that is really terrifying. And I do see the attacks as very much intertwined with ongoing persistent attacks on our public education system more broadly. So this is, this campaign to wipe out child labor standards is very much coming from the same groups that do not believe in public education because they believe in maintaining economic inequality and maintaining an underclass of impoverished families who are easy to exploit and who are desperate enough to have to accept low-wage work and under hazardous conditions, right? So that is the same groups that are, I mentioned that Florida, Foundation for Government Accountability Group. Their sort of priority package of policy proposals is rolling back child labor standards, but also what they're really pushing in a lot of states is things like restricting access to food benefits and SNAP, making it harder for people to get Medicaid, to have health care if you're a poor family, right? So it's this very toxic combination of increasing the economic desperation of our poorest families while legalizing unscrupulous exploitative behavior of employers who are willing to sort of recruit and hire kids for long hours, low wages, and exploitative conditions. We've had, if folks haven't seen them, I highly recommend looking at the journalism that Hannah Dreier has done at the New York Times in the past year to really humanize the conditions that we have young children working in all over the country.
Do you think that because there are some that are doing, like you said, like trying to trim away the extra guardrails that states have set up above and beyond federal laws, and what we're talking about in Alabama is that. But then the one that I talked about earlier is actually explicitly going below the federal floor, because it is not federally legal for children to work 30 or 40 hours in a work week. That is illegal under federal law. Do you think that there's in parallel with this move to trim away some of the additional guardrails, do you think there's a move to directly challenge the constitutionality of the Federal Labor Standards Act as such?
There, among some groups, there is both. Yes, absolutely. And there have definitely been state legislators who have openly said, I'm aware that what I'm proposing here is in contradiction to current federal law on a certain standard, And I'm happy about that because I think it'll call it to their attention, and Congress should also lower their standard too. Some of them are saying that very explicitly. We had a representative in Indiana at a hearing just this week, basically said that outright. Right. But I hate being the person to have to break this news to folks again and again this past year, but the reality is actually our federal law above for employers who hire anyone over the age of 15 and above, our federal law doesn't regulate work hours for 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds. I mean, these high school students, right? These are people who are still in school. And so that is another area where state standards have been so important and so fundamental. And I mean, frankly, states historically were often the leaders and the innovators. A lot of states had standards on factory work and mining and work in tobacco fields and many other things prior to the Fair Labor Standards Act because, you know, there was concern among policymakers at the state level who could see what was happening to children in these industries long before we had the Fair Labor Standards Act. So, I mean, believe it or not, there is no guardrail coming from our federal law because it's never been updated since 1938. Even, 1938 was a time when the vast majority of people in our country did not complete high school in the working class, right? We live in a different country now, in a different economy. Right. We've made incredible strides on opening up educational access, and we live in an economy where we know that young people who lack a high school credential or some other sort of credential will suffer lifelong consequences often because it limits their economic opportunity and suppresses their earnings for a lifetime, right? So if folks are trying to roll back state standards to push younger people into low-wage work for longer hours while they're still in high school, putting them at risk for not completing education and not having that credential, it's really turning back the clock. Because it's been amazing to me, this is not an area of research I had delved into until recently, but it's amazing to me to see the kind of strides that a lot of states have made on high school completion rates just in the last 20 or 30 years, right? So that's the kind of, that's actually progress. And so when we see that fewer 16-year-olds, for example, are in the labor force than they were in 1970 or 1980, that's actually a good thing. Right. They're not in the labor force because they're in school. And what that means is it's setting them up for a better career, a better lifelong income, a better set of opportunities for their family in the future. And so, when we've got state representatives in these hearings on child labor laws around the country often saying, oh, we're really, bummed out that 30 years ago, we had a higher labor force participation rate among teens. My jaw is just dropping. How is that a goal that we're pursuing in the 21st century? It is totally being driven by a set of low-wage industries that want to increase their access to immediate access to low-wage labor. That is all this is.
Right, absolutely. Well, Jennifer, I know we got to let you go, but I just want to thank you for your time and thank you for your work and your research. And I just want to point people to epi.org. That's where you can find out more about the Economic Policy Institute. There's a lot of great information there, on policy, on the connection between labor unions and democracy. There's a great report about the South and our failed economic model called Rooted in Racism that I highly recommend. I know it came out not too long ago. So Jennifer, thanks again for joining us this morning. Keep up the good work and appreciate you.
Yeah, take care. Great to talk to you guys.
Yep. All right. Thanks, y'all. So thanks, Jacob. Appreciate that.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and take a break really quick, and we're going to be right back talking about Shawn Fain. Stay tuned.
In Alabama, more than 200,000 of our friends and neighbors are living without health care coverage. Often folks can't stay healthy enough to keep their jobs. We need to fix this. Let's close the health care coverage gap. To learn more, visit coveralabama.org.
Support for this program also comes from the Ironworkers Local 477. So if you are looking for contractors with lower than average EMR and TRIR, they tell me that if you need to know what those mean, then you will. Or if you need to supplement a workforce at any level for any amount of time, short or long term, if you need ironworkers that come trained and certified at no extra cost, or if you need workers from superintendent down to general laborer, and you're looking to start work on a project, or you're unhappy with your current contractor situation, you need to call my friend Jeb Miles with the Ironworkers Local 477. They only work with the best in the business, vetted contractors, and can do all kinds of jobs, from roofing to steel and bridge erection, from welding to heavy rigging, from structural repairs to machinery alignment, and much more. They supply manpower on 4 of the 5 largest projects in North Alabama, so you know they're legit. If you need good quality, safe, efficient, diligent, and knowledgeable workers on your job, then you need the Ironworkers Local 477. Call Jeb Miles at 256-383-3334 or via email at local477@bellsouth.net, and make sure you tell them that you heard about them on the Valley Labor Report.
We're the nurses, firefighters, and claims representatives that help keep our government services running. We respond to natural disasters. We care for our nation's veterans, and we investigate discrimination in the workplace. We are federal and D.C. government workers, and we are proud to serve the American people. Working in more than 70 agencies across the government, we know we can fulfill our mission because our union has our back. Learn more at afge.org. Paid for by the American Federation of Government Employees, AFL-CIO.
The Laborers International Union of North America, Local 366, is proudly recruiting North Alabama workers to work construction and nuclear plant maintenance. If you're interested, please contact Donna at their training center to start the process. That phone number is 256-415-7452. Again, that phone number is 256-415-7452. No experience is needed. Free training is offered, but you must be able to pass a background check and a drug test. Local hiring that grows our community with good-paying jobs that have benefits is their mission. Live better, work union, Local 366, feel the power.
Support for this program also comes from the Mid-South Council of Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union. Learn more at rwdsu.info.
I'm Attorney Tommy Sinyard. When you've been injured and need help, you need a lawyer who's with you.
Sinyard Law. You need attorneys always available to take care of you. Sinyard Law.
And keep you in the loop. It's your case. You need to know what's happening.
Sinyard Law. And never a charge to meet with us to evaluate your case. Sinyard Law.
A new firm, but an old name. One that will stay with you every step of the way.
Sinyard Law. The name with proven results.
As labor union members, we face our share of challenges in the workplace. But today, I want to talk about a different kind of challenge, the climate crisis. We've all seen the fury of Mother Nature, the storms that can turn lives upside down in an instant. That's why Hometown Action is launching our Climate Protection Project. We're heading out to 10 rural communities, listening to local folks, and taking action with them to protect communities impacted by climate disasters. And we need you, our union brothers and sisters, to join us. Together, we'll make a difference. Our strength on the job is undeniable, and now it's time to put that strength to work for the planet. Let's protect our communities, our families, and our future. Visit hometownaction.org today and sign up to volunteer for the Climate Protection Canvas.
Come on, you poor workers, good news to you I'll tell, how the good old union has come in here to dwell.
only union talk radio show. This is the Valley Labor Report. My name is Jacob Morrison. My co-host is Adam Keller. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. Folks who are listening to us on Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star rating. Help us beat the other podcasts. Folks, if you're listening on Apple, if you're listening anywhere else, then do it too, but particularly on Apple. Our numbers are low on Apple. We need to get them up. Apple Podcast listeners, 5-star rating for the Valley Labor Report. Do it, folks. Want to also give you a couple of plugs because we're going to be ending on Fain's speech, and then we're going to react to it in the second half of the show. So just want to make sure before we go that we tell you about Labor Notes having their trainings this month. What to do when your union breaks your heart is another one that maybe some people find newly relevant. LaborNotes.org/events.
Could be timely.
Yeah, could be timely. LaborNotes.org/events. Check that out. Adam is also working with Alabama Arise to develop and host an advocacy training on January 29th. That's a couple of days from now at the downtown Huntsville Library from 5:30 to 7. If you believe Alabama should be better and you want to know how to get involved, then come on out. You can email Adam at alarise.org to RSVP. Alabama Arise is also going to be hosting a virtual action briefing the night before the legislative session starts on February 5th from 6 to 7:15. Go to alarise.org to find out more and register. If you're a college student, a college professor, or have any connection at all to a college campus, you may be interested in hosting a pro-labor event on campus. If you want to do that, then check out Labor Spring 2024, which is an initiative out of Georgetown University. And if you're in Alabama and interested, hit us up and we can help make that connection for you. Obviously, 844-899-8857 is the phone number if you want to give us a call and talk to us in overtime or leave us a voicemail throughout the week. Subscribe to our newsletters at tvlr.fm. And make sure you get on our email list, buy our hat, give us money, tvlr.fm/store, tvlr.fm/donate. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, so we're gonna like I said, we're gonna play Shawn Fain's speech, a big part of it endorsing Joe Biden, because there's a lot of really good stuff in there. Before we do that, though, he had another speech earlier in the week where he hit on several hot button issues, and we wanted to play that as well. And so particularly the border issue, because the border issue is really becoming, the conservative media arm is really trying hard to make people care about this issue, and it is veering more and more and more into open xenophobic anti-immigrant rhetoric. It's not even like, at some points, the rhetoric on the right regarding immigration shifts between pragmatic and really kind of morally charged language. And so on the pragmatic end, the pragmatic kind of anti-immigration end, you can hear arguments about, oh, well, it's not good for the economy. I understand they want a better life, but we need to look out for Americans, and it's not their fault. But we just can't handle all these immigrants. It's just we can't handle it, right, as a country. And so there's like a pragmatic end there. And then on the other end is what we're seeing today. This rhetoric of an invasion, this rhetoric of the people who are coming across the border are not coming. They're just explicitly denying that these people are coming to make their lives better. They are saying that these people are coming across the border for some reason, risking their life, right, to make this trek. Their children's lives, to make this trek to destroy the country. Like, it's, evil, evil kind of stuff coming out. And one of the people putting out this wicked and vile rhetoric is coming from Congressman Dale Strong. Congressman Dale Strong in Alabama's 5th District talking about this and saying explicitly, if you believe those 200 plus that I saw coming through the mountain, that they're coming for jobs, they're not. They're coming to destroy America. And this is really a far cry, because remember, the argument used to be these aren't asylum seekers, these are economic migrants, right? That used to be the argument. And now it's gone even further in saying, no, these aren't even economic migrants. They are evil people who are coming to destroy our country. And, you know, and also in different instances, they're telling people that, you know, these people want to kill you and sexually, you know, assault your daughters. And I mean, just the most xenophobic, evil, anti-human, Christian in the kind of orthodox sense of the word. I mean, it's really kind of astounding, some of the stuff that's coming out. And now it's driving this, divide between the states and the federal government, where there's a real potential of a constitutional crisis like that. I have never been as worried about the state of the country as I am today. I had always been, in 2016 and 2020, of the opinion that some of the rhetoric around Trump and the Republicans veered into histrionics. And that is becoming less and less true, because the danger that Trump and the Republican Party represent to this country is becoming more and more real. And so anyway, Shawn Fain expertly dissected this rhetoric about we should hate immigrants. Let's play this.
They try to divide us nationally by nationality. Right now, we have millions of people being told that the biggest threat to their livelihood is migrants coming over the border. The threat we face at the border isn't from the migrants. It's from the billionaires and the politicians getting working people to point the finger at one another, when in reality, we're all on the same side of the war against the working class. This gets personal for me. Every time I see this shit on the TVs and stuff about the border security and that being a major issue in this election, it's not. It's a joke, and it's done nothing but to divide the people. Why I say this is personal to me is because when I see destitute and desperate people crossing a border, risking their lives, I think of my grandparents, who had a lot easier fate, but at the end of the day, they were still destitute and desperate, but they had to cross state lines instead of federal lines. But they did the same thing. They went somewhere else to find a better life. That's all these people are trying to do. And my grandparents were lucky enough in the early days of the UAW. They didn't tell my grandparents, "You're not welcome here. Go back to where you came from." They said, "If you're ready to fight for a better life, sign your union card and let's go get it." You know, they try to divide us by race. I had the honor last week of speaking at the Martin Luther King Day rally and march in Detroit. And more than anything, Dr. King taught us that the civil rights movement and the labor movement will forever be intertwined. And a big reason we're intertwined and we rise and fall together is because as long as the billionaire class has black and white and working class people of all races divided against each other, the powerful forces of greed and domination will prevail. That's how the forces of corporate greed and the billionaire class use division to weaken the working class. Our answer to that is solidarity. Our answer to that is unity. Our answer to that is union. It might sound simple, and maybe it is. That's part of the game they play too. The billionaires want to make you think that this stuff is complicated, that DC is for people with PhDs and legal degrees and
on the end of our time to be able to play this from Fain's endorsement of Biden. And I want to play this long segment. It's going to be about 15 minutes. We're going to end the show, in the main show on this, and we're going to come back in overtime and react to it. So here we are, ending with Shawn Fain's endorsement of Joe Biden. And stay tuned. Find us on Facebook and YouTube to hear our reaction and give your comments.
So when we talk about this election, let's take a look at the candidates in their own words and their own actions. In 2008, I happened to have a first-class seat as a negotiator during the economic recession. And in 2008, as you well know, the auto industry faced a historic crisis. We were on the edge of total collapse. With entire communities were being devastated. Hundreds of thousands of auto workers' families were left out in the street. It was our members and our retirees who sacrificed everything to save the auto industry. In that moment, Donald Trump said, and I quote, "I think that the unions are really, really hurting very badly what's going on with the auto industry," end of quote. Joe Biden, having helped save the auto industry, said the nation bet on the American auto workers and won. In 2015, when he was first running for president, Trump went even further. He said the concessions we took weren't enough. He wanted to do a rotation in the auto industry of the jobs in Michigan and the Midwest, so union auto workers would be begging for their jobs back at lower pay. He wanted to put the race to the bottom on steroids to screw the American working class. Also, I love the fire. Love the energy. Also in 2015, we have some workers you saw earlier from Volkswagen. In 2015, people may have forgotten this. We won our first election of a group of skilled trades workers at Volkswagen. And we're still trying to organize there today. And you want to know why? Because, like always, in true fashion, the corporate class in Volkswagen defied the law and they refused to bargain. And they did this for one reason. They were dragging it out as long as they could because they knew that Trump's National Labor Relations Board would undo our victory. That set us back a decade. President Biden, on the other hand, has made changes at the National Labor Relations Board that have opened new opportunities for organizing. He has vocally supported workers organizing and said at a UAW event, join, organize, picket, protest. You have a right to form a union, and you cannot be stopped. You cannot be intimidated. It matters who runs the National Labor Relations Board. If we're going to grow our union and organize the unorganized and help the working class, we have to have the right people in power. But it's not just about organizing. Let's talk about plant closures. In 2019, at the height of profits, GM closed Lordstown Assembly Plant. And GM is to blame for that decision. But then President Trump stood by and let it happen. Worse, he joined in the beating after telling Lordstown workers, don't sell your houses. What did he do? Trump attacked Brother David Green, who was then president of Local 1112 and is now serving as our Region 2B director. Trump said our union dues were to blame for the plant closure, when we all know it was all about corporate greed. In 2023, Belvedere Assembly Plant was slated for closure by Stellantis. So we fought like hell to do the unthinkable, to save Belvedere and save a community. And with the power of the stand-up strike, we did that. But what I don't want you to forget is we also, in that fight, had the President of the United States by our side every step of the way. Instead of talking trash about our union, Joe Biden stood with us and supported our historic victory to save Belvedere and to save that community. And let's talk about making history. Rarely, as a union, do you get so clear of a choice between two candidates. In 2019, and I want you guys to pay attention to these two slides we're about to show you. In 2019, our members were out there holding the line at GM on a national strike for 40 days. Trump was the sitting president. And I want to show you a picture of what Trump said and what actions he took to help the American auto workers striking at GM when he was president. He said nothing, he did nothing, not a damn thing, because he doesn't care about the American worker. Now here's what Trump did to help the American auto worker in our 2023 historic stand-up strike now that he's running for president. He went to a non-union plant, invited by the boss, and trashed our union. That's right. And here is what Joe Biden did during our stand-up strike. He heard the call, and he stood up, and he showed up. He joined us in solidarity on the picket line for the first time in our nation's history. A sitting president has ever done that. He said on live national TV that the big three, and I quote, should go further to ensure that record corporate profits mean record contracts for the UAW and the workers. So that's a choice we face. It's not about who you like. It's not about your party. It's not this bullshit about age. It's not about anything but our best shot at taking back power for the working class. UAW, UAW, UAW. Donald Trump is a scab. Donald Trump is a billionaire, and that's who he represents. If Donald Trump ever worked in an auto plant, he wouldn't be a UAW member. He'd be a company man trying to squeeze the American worker. Donald Trump stands against everything we stand for as a union, as a society. When you go back to our core issues, wages, retirement, health care, and our time, that's what this election's about. This election's about who will stand up with us and who will stand in our way. Those are the questions that will win or lose this election and will decide our fate. Those are the questions that will determine the future of our country and the fate of the working class. When I first came into office, we made some headlines by saying that our endorsements would be earned, not freely given. We've said we'd stand with whoever stood with us in our fight. Not because somebody was nice to us and we want to be nice to them, but because we need to know who's going to put up and who's going to shut up. And going even further, we need to know who's going to stand up with us. And this choice is clear. Joe Biden bet on the American worker, while Donald Trump blamed the American worker. We need to know who's going to sit in the most powerful seat in the world and help us win as a united working class. So if our endorsements must be earned, Joe Biden has earned it. So when we talk about this election,
all right,
let's take a look.
All right, so folks, we are off the radio now. That was Shawn Fain's speech endorsing Joe Biden. Really, a lot of really good stuff in that speech, a lot of accurate stuff and important stuff for people to hear regarding Trump. And so we are now off the radio. We're going to be right back with Overtime. We are going to give y'all some of the reactions to this endorsement. Be willing to take your comments. 844-899 TVLR is the phone number. The lines are open. So we'll be right back, folks. Stay tuned.
Come on, you poor workers, good news to you I'll tell. How the good old union has come in here to dwell.
Welcome back. You are still listening to the Valley Labor Report. We are now in the second half of the show that we call Overtime. We are on the online only. We have freed ourselves from the shackles of the FCC censors, and we appreciate you staying tuned, folks. We have over 30 people watching us right now, and only 26 likes. So if you have not liked the stream, then please do that. If you have not subscribed to the channel, then please do that. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at tvlr.fm/contact. Appreciate everybody tuning in. Got some folks in the Facebook chat. Ray Pierce says we love Jennifer up here in Iowa. That's great. Joe and Mel in the chat. Good morning. Appreciate y'all tuning in. Ben, Jada, Union Joe, Marissa, Penny, Jose, Omni, Chrome, and I think that's everybody that I've seen. Notary S, Brandon. Yeah, appreciate all y'all in the YouTube chat hanging out with us. There were comments throughout the show about the UAW's endorsement. Pittsburgh Dude 87 said, after the UAW called for a ceasefire, Shawn Fain endorsed Genocide Joe, who also broke up the rail workers strike. What a disappointment. And F YouTube Censorship said Trump caused a lot of the problems and would make everything worse. It's not disappointing at all to try to stop Trump. And that's kind of the and then the one of the more recent comments, Notary S said, I was expecting an eventual dim endorsement, but it was too early. Lost a lot of bargaining power. Still a fan of Fain and the union, and I'm sure they had reasons I don't know, but that's my personal take. And those are kind of that's pretty representative of the range of opinions about this, and I think the latter being the most common, or at least the most common among kind of the labor left, the people who are kind of in the same circles as we are, ideologically and strategically. There's, I think, something approaching a consensus view that this was still too early and the timing didn't make sense, with it being about 9 months out from the election. But a lot of the people that are saying that, it's still a pretty consensus view that, the union should probably endorse Biden at some point. The question is only kind of when. Teamster and steering committee co-chair for the Teamsters for a Democratic Union, Shawn, also a member of the DSA Labor Commission steering committee, said, we should debate whether or not leverage was maximized, but endorsing Biden to block a second Trump term is ultimately the right thing to do the right thing for any union to be doing right now. On the effectiveness of Shawn Fain, which is why I wanted to play that, and why I wanted to play that speech, and why I wanted to play that speech for the radio audience. Miles Kampf-Lassen, who works for In These Times, he said that maybe the best spokesperson to take on Trump and make the case he's an anti-working class candidate in 2024 is UAW President Shawn Fain. Sounds like he's already on the campaign trail, and Biden is extremely lucky. And that is, of course, true. Whatever you think about literally anything else, that is just objectively true, that Shawn Fain is one of the best people to do this, and he is doing that, making the case that Trump is an anti-working class candidate in the most effective way that I have heard throughout the campaign season. I have not heard a more convincing speech for the Biden candidacy than what we just played. And I think that we're going to see more of that from Shawn Fain, whether that's something that folks want to see or not. I think that's something that we will see. Somebody else, another union member on Twitter, said, of course the UAW endorsed Biden. Trump winning means that tens of thousands of UAW members could lose bargaining rights. Republicans do not believe that grad workers should be able to form unions. Trump's administration literally tried to take it away when he was president. And that is true. It is interesting then, there's an interesting kind of tension there, though, because in many ways, higher education workers have the most to lose from a Republican NLRB because their entire right to exist as such could be taken away. And yet they are the ones in the UAW kind of leading the call for a ceasefire. There are, of course, calls for a ceasefire in the UAW from other sectors, but the higher ed seems to be at the forefront of this campaign within the UAW. There was one UAW member, a public defender on Twitter, said that whatever your opinion of the UAW Biden endorsement, it stung to see one of my best friends dragged out of the CAP conference. And it was painful seeing my union siblings who organized day and night for a ceasefire to be drowned out. And that is something that happened during Biden's speech, where there were chants for a ceasefire, and those chants were drowned out by UAW, which I also found extremely distasteful. I found it as distasteful as the people in the church in South Carolina saying 4 more years as people were calling for a ceasefire. I think just the language of 4 more years while people are chanting for a ceasefire is even more kind of like jarring, yeah, than just chanting UAW. But Region 9A Director Brandon Mancia said, I am disgusted and disappointed in the response from members and leaders that started chanting UAW to drown out the protests. Our union's name should not be used as a tool to silence speech for peace and social justice. And I think that is, I think that makes a lot of sense as well. You didn't have to, there was no reason to do that because the Secret Service was pulling these people out. And UAW members did not have to, dirty their hands with that. There was no reason for that at all, right? They could have just let the Secret Service take those folks out, and then Biden goes on with his speech. I think chanting UAW, like Mancia said, was really kind of a step too far, and like you said, Adam, jarring. Yeah, I wouldn't have done it. Reporting on those protesters being dragged out, though, there was an attempt to separate the protesters from the UAW. The White House New York Times reporter, in fact, their reporting on this said, quote, Gaza protesters dragged out on the floor by their hands at this Biden speech, UAW workers trying to drown them out. Right, so they're trying to say that these are different groups of people when in fact
it's the helmets versus hard hats thing again.
Well, no, I mean they're just saying that they're not UAW workers when they are. The protesters were UAW workers, right?
Right.
Whatever their sector, they were UAW workers. They were not a separate entity from the delegates. They were delegates to the conference, members of the UAW, elected or appointed by whatever mechanism their local union had to send them to this conference.
Absolutely.
Democratically accountable and with that authority.
Yeah, and it's pretty gross to see the media, try to misconstrue that.
Another reporter said, workers don't seem surprised that the UAW endorsed Biden, but some are discouraged by the timing, especially as many in the crowds today and yesterday cheered as Shawn Fain and Rashida Tlaib called for peace in Gaza. Workers argue this early endorsement dulls their leverage. And that is, really the theme surrounded the timing and the dissonance with the UAW's official position as calling for a ceasefire and then endorsing Biden as this is all happening. And, Fain himself, like this reporter said, spoke about the Israel-Palestine issue. And so I pulled this clip. Let's just go ahead and play that so you can hear what Shawn Fain had to say about the issue.
As I said last Monday, we celebrated Martin Luther King Day. And what Dr. King taught us is that the fight for economic and social justice is not bound by space or time. We don't stop our fight for justice at the workplace. We don't stop our fight for justice because it's not the right time. When and where there's a war, whether it's Vietnam or in Gaza, we call for peace.
Didn't spend as much time on that as he did other issues, but it was it was a strong statement there and unambiguous. Alex Press in Jacobin eloquently, as always, wrote about why, because then there's the question, okay, why would this preclude the UAW from endorsing them, at least at this time? Why would a union even take a stance on foreign policy issues? And in Jacobin, Alex Press writes the column, "Internationalism is in labor's interests." She says, why do labor unions take positions on foreign policy? This is Alex Press. It's a fair question, but the truth is that foreign policy is not really, quote, foreign. It affects the lives of union members every day, and some members are more concerned with securing a ceasefire than whether Trump or Biden wins the presidential election. And setting aside the fact that many union members have family and friends who have been killed or maimed by Israel in recent months, and that a broad coalition of Palestinian unions has called for solidarity from their fellow workers around the world, not to mention the immorality of sitting on the sidelines during a massacre, war has economic effects. Later in the article, she talks about the U.S. labor movement's weakness in foreign policy historically, saying, when we don't support Mexican auto workers building independent unions that can actually raise their standards, we condemn ourselves to further job loss domestically as employers relocate south of the border to exploit a more captive workforce. Union members know that the floor must be raised for everyone, or the boss will begin moving work to those who do it on the cheap. This applies globally, too. There's a special obligation here in the labor movement to protect our brothers and sisters no matter where they may live. It is an extension of the same principle of domestic unionism. Workers divided among themselves will always be weaker in the long run. That's a very, very eloquent case for internationalism, and a correct one in my view. Gonna share some more of Mancia's statement on the UAW's endorsement, because he had a lot of good stuff to say. And there was another interesting story that he relayed. So he said that, so Mancia, in his statement, you can find the whole statement on Twitter, he said that at the request of President Shawn Fain, I and the rest of my colleagues on the International Executive Board voted to endorse Joe Biden for President of the United States. In our deliberations, I expressed my deep reservations about Biden's policies and the vital importance of our union's call for a ceasefire. And they said, he said that during the, there was a conversation with Biden where Mancia and another Region 9A member emphasized directly to Biden that the UAW has called for a ceasefire and demands an end to the killing of innocent civilians in Palestine. President Biden engaged us in conversation for a few minutes, and we made it clear to him that our membership stands by our call for a ceasefire. And here's the story that was another kind of like, wow, why did kind of kick in the gut. Afterwards, I was told by White House staff that if I did not remove the 3 stickers from my jacket that read UAW Peace Justice, UAW for Ceasefire, and UAW Work for Peace before entering the stage with my fellow International Executive Board members, President Biden would cancel his speech. I refused to remove any of these stickers, especially the UAW for Ceasefire one, and it turns out it was an empty threat. As an elected representative of our membership, I have every right to appear publicly before the membership at a UAW event displaying support for our union's positions, and President Biden should know he can't boss us around. And then he talks about how there have been calls for the UAW's endorsement process to be reformed, to make it more democratic so that it is not done just on a vote of the International Executive Board. Talks about work around that and around ceasefire work more generally. So yeah, I thought that was a good statement. Putting out, giving some people some more information and setting out some important principles on democracy and internationalism. So there you go.
Yeah, we had some conversation in the chat as well. New York Times always siding with the bosses. Totally agree with that comment. That is, there are some good reporters doing good work for the New York Times, no doubt. We mentioned some of that earlier this morning. But yeah, it's never shocking to me if the New York Times, mischaracterizes something in a way that is not good for working people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Jose, I see there's some comments about the TDU, and there was, I'm sure that you saw John Palmer's letter. We're going to talk about that later in the program, John Palmer's letter to Shawn O'Brien. But before that, we have a guest. Is he in the Zoom?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. So there are now actually 2 podcasts about the CIO. The CIO, obviously a very important institution in the history of American labor, and so there are now 2 podcasts talking about that, and we're going to have to talk to the folks involved in the other one. But this one is a project of Jacobin. The host is Benjamin Fong, and he is the structure of the podcast is really interesting because Fong's voice does not appear a whole lot. It's actually a lot of historians and archival audio tapes, and so it makes for an interesting listen, pulling all of these voices together to create a narrative around the CIO. And so I have enjoyed it. I've listened to all of them so far. I don't know how many are going to come out, but they've been coming out weekly. So here to talk about that with us is Benjamin Fong, host of Organize the Unorganized, the Jacobins podcast about the CIO. Benjamin, thanks for taking the time. I think he is he muted, or can you hear him, Adam?
Oh,
Oh, I heard you say, and then you went silent again.
There we go.
All right. I think it should be working now.
You're good. You're
great.
good.
Thanks, man.
Okay,
yeah, so
great.
thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I was just saying, mercifully, you don't have to hear that much of my voice on the podcast. I narrate it pretty minimally just to tie things together. But it's mostly comprised of interviews with labor historians, labor experts, telling the story of the CIO, and of course, songs and archival clips interspersed throughout.
One of my favorite things about, I mean, there are many great things about the labor movement in the mid-20th century, but one of the things that I really loved was the focus on music, and I have enjoyed your use of that tradition of music in the labor movement. How did you pick those songs specifically?
So there were CIO, UAW songbooks that you can find. Some of them are online. Some of them you can find through different libraries. And I mostly relied upon those things that were included in those songbooks, songs that people at the time would have sung on the picket line. In some cases, the CIO put out documentaries where they use music, and so I drew from those as well. The CIO, especially the later CIO, was a very active media conglomerate, you could say. They had radio programs, they had TV spots, they did a lot of media work to try to influence mass culture to be in the interest of the working class. An ambivalent legacy there, of course. But they tried, and as a result, they put together a lot of great material to draw from. It was a great time for music because a lot of great new songs were being created, oftentimes from old spirituals, adapted to the union context. But they were also drawing upon songs from the IWW and, older songs. So it wasn't necessarily the most creative time for labor music, but it was a fun time because there was a lot of material to draw from.
Yes, and I think I come from a religious background. I'm not religious anymore, but in the church that I grew up at, there was a very strong emphasis on music as a collective enterprise, right? So at the church that I grew up at, there was really a culture of participation in that part of the service, and the song leader in the church was like, it doesn't matter how you sound, we're just doing this for the Lord, and we're just making a joyful noise, and so everybody participate. And there was a really high percentage of participation, and you could really feel like a togetherness there. I think there was kind of a similar thing going on with union music during that time because they were taken from a lot of these spirituals, and so the emphasis wasn't necessarily on is this the most kind of artistically valuable piece of art that's been created ever, or is this the most creative or the most interesting thing? The thing was, how can we get the most people participating in this activity, make them feel together? And so that, relying on spirituals makes sense because a lot of people already know those songs. And that kind of flows into a good union ethic, right? Because it's all about a collective project, the project of organized labor. And so, moving away from my own kind of niche interest in music and and labor, what made you and Jacobin want to do a project about the CIO during this time?
Yeah, I mean, just real quickly on the previous point, what is noticeable about CIO organizers and the key CIO leaders is that they were laser focused on reaching that mass audience, right? They did so much to create what historian Elizabeth Cohen and one of the podcast guests calls a culture of unity. And this was a time where there were a lot of different kinds of divisions, obviously racial divisions, but ethnic divisions as well that aren't as salient today as they were then. And they knew that to organize the industrial working class, they needed to create a mass culture. And this was partially made possible by new technological developments at the time, radio, television, right? The formation of a nascent mass culture in America. But they did a ton to participate in that. And anything that worked to reach people, to reach masses of people, they wanted to be involved in. And that sort of segues to your question, which is the reason for taking on the podcast. Like we like to talk about labor upsurges, and there have been many notable ones throughout American history. Knights of Labor in 1886, around World War I and the aftermath, 1919. Public sector unionism in the 60s and 70s, and these are all sort of key moments where you saw these huge dramatic membership increases for organized labor. But if you look at the history, there's actually really nothing comparable to the CIO moment. It's the one moment where masses of American workers joined the labor movement, and not only that, but stayed in the labor movement for a really long time. I mean, it really seemed like a permanent breakthrough in the achievement of collective bargaining, and it wasn't, but it was stable enough that it lasted for a really long time despite employer opposition. And I don't think we often appreciate just what a unique moment it was. Obviously, any student of labor history knows the 30s was important, but it was a one time where you can point to in American history where the working class definitively won, where there was a revolution in working class living standards and life. And I think it ought to be mined for its significance today, but also looked at for the different kinds of strategies and tactics employed by CIO organizers, because it was a ripe political economic opportunity they took advantage of, but they did a lot of smart things that I think that we can learn from today as well.
Yes, and they also, you talk about this in the last episode, and so I don't know if now there's going to be a turn towards a critique of the CIO, but you mentioned that there's really a mythology based some in fact, and then also based in ignoring some facts about the CIO, and the mythology being that this was this really radical democratic experiment that was, bottom up and everything, and everything was great and it was all good. And in your last episode, you start to touch on the fact that, there's some contradictions here, particularly in the steelworkers campaign that I had. And there's actually a similar history to the steelworkers in the paper mills. And so it's kind of interesting that the paper unions merged with the steelworkers, who had a very similar kind of top-down, boss-friendly organization in contrast with the auto workers and UE. And so I want to touch on that first, but or on that later. But can you explain to us what are the positive developments, or how did the positive developments come about from the CIO? The auto industries and the organization of the auto industry in particular really was a pretty uniquely bottom-up democratic, and radical enterprise. How did that happen, and what were the ramifications of that?
Sure. It was a unique situation. I think the first thing to say is that a lot of what made the CIO successful would have been really difficult to pull off outside of the context of the 30s. I mean, this was a radial society-wide crisis that America was going through with the Great Depression. A lot of people felt that industrial capitalism was on its deathbed, and people were suffering. But there was also just a widespread discontent with existing structures that, I would say certainly doesn't exist today in that precise form. And that sort of rife anti-capitalism that pervaded the society amongst the working class, but against, amongst other classes as well, was a unique context. And it meant that, when FDR was elected, there was an expectation of radical change, even though, even if FDR himself might not have expected that. When people like Frank Murphy, who was the governor of Michigan, was elected, they were elected on promises to work for working people, to not break strikes. And so in the context of 36, 37, when you start to get the resumption of various radical tactics, and specifically the sit-down strike, workers not just striking and leaving the factory and going on the picket line, but just staying put and shutting down production. This is a radical tactic. It's something that at other points in American history and in other places at the time were shut down quite violently. The National Guard was sent in and whatnot. But it was because of the particular political context where, again, there was this rife anti-capitalism, and there was a political environment that was committed to at least being neutral with regard to organized labor, if not supportive, at least being neutral in the fight. That you got the success of these radical tactics. And so, with the Flint strike in GM, it went on for 44 days. They were extremely smart about what they did. Near the end of that time, they worked, and I sort of narrate the sequence here in the last episode that was put online, the third episode. They worked very strategically to occupy the most economically significant plant. It was where the motors were made. They knew that. And so they actually did this whole distraction strike at a different plant so that they could occupy plant number 4. And when they did that, GM sort of realized we can't do anything now, right? They understood the strategic choke point. They seized it. And again, because Governor Murphy wouldn't send in the cops, they quickly came to the table. So I would say, to get to your point just a second ago, it was really in the marriage of different elements at the moment. It was the marriage of the willingness to take on radical tactics, combined with a ripe political economic environment, and then combined with, certain top-down elements that were really willing to exploit the discontent of the moment towards building stable collective bargaining structures. And so there was a lot that CIO leaders did that was really smart. It wasn't sexy, it wasn't radical, it wasn't revolutionary. But for instance, in the steelworkers, which you just mentioned, they had a very top-down strategy. I mean, the U.S. Steel was organized at a hotel meeting between Myron Taylor and John L. Lewis. It's difficult to get any more top-down than that. But they also had this strategy of working within the company unions to take them over. And, you could say that was sort of a compromise strategy from the start. Like, why work with these compromised structures of the company unions? They're just run by the bosses. But it was a good point of leverage. And I think something like, 125,000 of the initial membership of the Steelworkers Organizing Committee came through these company unions. They went in to organize the company unions and brought them over to the Steelworkers Organizing Committee. So there was a lot of smart tactical stuff there that they did that wasn't, again, revolutionary or radical, but was very important in building the CIO.
You mentioned briefly the distraction occupation by the UAW during the Flint strike, which pulled all of the company's forces to try to rebut this sit-down in the distraction sit-down, and they were able to then occupy the plant that they really wanted. And I would encourage people to read The Many and the Few by Henry Krause, who was the UAW's news editor when that happened. His recounting of that series of events is really interesting, and his whole the whole book is really an easy read, as history books go. It's written in a narrative format. And from a first-person account, and so it's pretty easy to read, and he does a really good job of making it easy to understand and interesting and engaging. I couldn't put it down when I was reading it, and I had just finished reading Midnight in the Vehicle City too. So this is even after I had already read a book about the Flint sit-down strike, and I still couldn't put it down. It was a great book. That was an interesting story in it, and one of the things about the sit-down strikes in particular that I'm wondering if you've spent much time reading about is the theory of property that they said, or that some people said, justified the sit-downing of the in the factories, right? Because it's an obvious kind of violation of property rights, as is commonly understood, but there was a sort of uncommon understanding of property rights that some people had. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, this is a theory that CIO lawyers in particular were really apt to push, and the theory was that workers had a right to their job, that their job constituted a kind of property, and that they were merely exercising their right to retain that property. In the American courts, you can imagine, this didn't receive a friendly welcome, but the sit-downs were of questionable status for a really long time. And one dynamic that's interesting about the sit-down strikes is that it was a challenge to organize, right? It was to get these intransigent employers to finally come to the table, and that worked. Right? When GM settled with the union, when they recognized the UAW, it was huge, right? I mean, it would be like Amazon doing something today. Recognizing a Teamsters union. I mean, it was just a complete sea change. Everyone knew it. This is part of what precipitated the organization of steel. So it was a big moment. But the sit downs were also a challenge to the legal system as well. The Wagner Act, which created the National Labor Relations Act, which created the sort of modern legal architecture for labor relations, which is still with us. It had passed in 1935. And almost right away, the employers said, we're not going to abide by this. Like, this is unconstitutional. And there were all these challenges in the courts to the Wagner Act. And part of what the sit-downs were about was to get employers to uphold the Wagner Act, right? They're saying, like, yeah, okay, we're doing something quasi-illegal, but you know what? You're doing something illegal as well in not abiding by this law.
Right.
And so when the sit-down wave crested, the Supreme Court finally declared the Wagner Act constitutional, and so they stabilized that collective bargaining regime. They said, they said to employers, no, you really got to deal with these unions, right? This is a new era that we've entered into of industrial relations, and you have to deal with the unions. You've got to negotiate them. You've got to recognize them. But at the same time, the Supreme Court goes and declares the sit-down tactic straightforwardly unconstitutional, right? So what the essential bargain was, okay, we will give you stable collective bargaining, but all this industrial strife that you've caused in 1936-37, that needs to end, and that needs to end yesterday. So it was a kind of grand bargain, and I think the CIO leadership knew it from the beginning. That was the bargain they wanted to strike. They wanted to say, hey, we will provide stability in your industry, but you better give us a contract, or we're going to be, just let this thing get out of control. That was the promise of the CIO. And some people see that as constraining a more radical upsurge of the CIO moment. And some people see it as brilliantly bottling that energy into a stable institutional form.
There was a quote, you're talking about, some thoughts about constraining more radical elements. And there was a quote, and I can't remember if it was in your podcast or if I read it somewhere else, but that, everybody knows that communists, or a lot of people know that communists were very active in the CIO. They were some of the best organizers in the CIO were communists and socialists, and that was not unknown to the leaders of the CIO,
Yep.
like John L. Lewis. And there was a quote, I think, from Lewis saying something about, you have to know who the hunter and the dogs are. And I'm happy to have communists as the dogs as long as I'm the hunter, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So basically, like, as long as I can keep these people on a leash, like, whatever, they can believe whatever they want, but as long as it serves me and kind of my interest in power, and Lewis, I think it was in that podcast, because there was one episode on personalities, and Lewis being a shapeshifter in some of the tactics, right? Because he was in the early 1900s more conservative and like less kind of keen on industrial unionism, and then he becomes the leader of industrial unionism, right?
Yeah, and that was Who Gets the Bird, the hunter or the dog, and it was an extremely he was it was not unintentional to call the communist dogs. He understood the insult involved, but part of what he was trying to relay is that he had the situation under control, right? To all the people within the CIO who were worried about the communist organizers, the communists in positions of leadership in certain unions, he related to them, look, we're going to use them for a little bit, and then we're going to kick them out.
Right.
And that's sort of what happened, not under his watch, because he would leave in 1940, but that's sort of what eventually happened. Who Gets the Bird was the title of a newsletter by Jonah Furman, who's now at the UAW. But yeah, I mean, Lewis is a contradictory character. He, in the 1920s, was recognized as a very autocratic, dictatorial union leader. He did a lot of things of questionable moral character then and later. But he was interested in power. In the 1920s, it was a really difficult time to be head of the coal miners. The anthracite coal industry was dying. And just given the general mood of the 20s, the sort of welfare capitalism programs and whatnot, unions in general were in decline. And then a lot of them were really gutted with the Great Depression. And then, comes along Roosevelt and the National Industrial Relations Act, and Lewis had been very instrumental in pushing for Section 7A of the NIRA, which formally guaranteed workers the right to organize and join unions of their own choosing. It didn't really have any teeth to it, but it did give some legal sanction for Lewis and the mine workers to go out into the coal fields and say, hey, the president wants you to join a union, right? Now's the time. And so they do, and in 1933, they work out the bituminous coal code that they had basically sought since the founding of the union in 1890, and it was an industry-wide coal code, with FDR's blessing, and it was a huge win, and it rebuilt the mine workers, right? They went from a union of less than 100,000 to all of a sudden a union of 600,000, a very powerful political player, very, very quickly. And Lewis kind of looked around at the moment to other union leaders, and he said, what are you all doing, right? This is the moment. Right now, you have to rebuild your union. Like there's not going to come along a time like this in the future. Like this is the moment that you have to seize. And so with Sidney Hillman of the clothing workers and David Dubinsky of the garment workers and a few other AFL leaders, they broke off to form the Committee on Industrial Organizations and then eventually the Congress of Industrial Organization, with the idea that, there wasn't going to come along a time that was better to organize industrial workers, despite the AFL's resistance to organizing unskilled workers. And so they did. And you could say that this was a radical departure for Lewis. In a lot of ways it was, like, for him to become a champion of the working class after being this autocratic union boss in the 1920s. But you could also say it's very consonant with his character from that period as well, in that he saw an opportunity for power,
right,
and he seized it.
Right. Yeah. explain the difference between an industrial unionism that kind of the CIO pushed and the craft unionism of the AFL. Why was it industrial unionism that really that really captured this moment of opportunity and not the established labor movement, right? Because there was it wasn't as big. I mean, it was probably the AFL before the 1930s, 1920s was probably about the size of the labor movement today. I can't remember. I'm not exactly sure the percentage, but it was not much bigger or smaller. And so there was a big base there among the American Federation of Labor. Why did they and their vision of craft unionism, why were they not able to take advantage of the opportunity presented? And why was industrial unionism able to do that?
Yeah, I mean, by the numbers, the AFL at the time of the break with the CIO was about the same size as the labor movement today. It was about 10% of American workers. The latest BLS numbers just came out. It's exactly 10%. One could argue that the American Federation of Labor was actually in a much better situation in terms of its leverage at that point, because it was all private sector workers. Public sector unionism was not legal. It was not legalized at that point. And so, and FDR famously came out when certain government workers did try to organize and said, you can't organize against the government, right? Like he just couldn't wrap his mind around public sector unionism. So it was 10%, but it was a powerful 10%. The American Federation of Labor came along in 1886, and it remained the dominant labor federation in America until the 1930s. And I think part of its staying power, despite the fact that it was self-limited, exclusionary, racist, problematic in all sorts of different ways. Despite all that stuff, it had staying power because it had a theory of leverage and power that did make sense of the American economy at a certain point in history, right? They wanted to organize particular workers with certain skills that could not be replaced. And so it was a kind of labor aristocracy. You still see iterations of craft, like very powerful iterations of craft unionism today. The Nurses Union, National Nurses United, CNA, like that's essentially a craft union, right? Like they understand they have a certain power within their workplace that is greater than that of, hospital techs and whatnot. And so they form their own union that's separate from other healthcare workers. With the idea that by organizing their particular trade with their particular skills, they're going to have power. And it's a theory of labor power that actually works. And at that time in the American economy, it was particularly apt with sort of itinerant, skilled tradespeople, like moving from town to town. Once you get the formation of these huge factories, right, the sort of mass production era, that theory of labor power begins to make less and less sense, right? It's not that you can't still execute it. It just becomes really self-defeating in a lot of ways. And so what the AFL would do when it went into these big factories is try to hive off workers according to different jurisdictions, right? They'd say, okay, this particular skilled tradesperson goes to this union, this particular skilled tradesperson goes to this union, and the rest of these unskilled workers, like, we're not going to deal with because they're not organizable. That's sort of their approach. And you can imagine if you're going into a factory thinking about division first, you're not going to do very well. And so this theory of labor power was just particularly unsuited to the development of mass production. And Lewis, Hillman, Dubinsky, they saw it. They understood that they're like, hey, we're in a new era and we need new organizing committees, new organizing techniques if we're going to take advantage.
Adam wrote in our note document that we keep on the property rights question is that actually tenure for teachers in Alabama started as a property right.
So that's my understanding. Yeah, that was kind of like, how it developed here. So that's interesting that you bring that up. And one thing that I wanted to kind of circle back to, Jacob, if it's okay, is you talked about the culture of unity that the CIO was really building, and not to spend too much time on like the cultural aspects, but I think that's really interesting in their use of radio and emerging technologies. And I think it's obviously we're on a labor radio show podcast, right? So we are trying to do, that kind of work in the same spirit. So I really appreciated you bringing that up, and maybe we'll have time to circle back to that. But I'll let you get back to it, Jacob.
Well, no, yeah.
I'm
what are
curious,
your thoughts on that, Ben?
Yeah, I'm just curious.
No,
what do you think about that in terms of today, like 2024? How does that look today, and what could we learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult lesson to apply in a lot of ways. I think when Cohen talked about the culture of unity, there was the exploitation of new mass cultural mechanisms that the CIO was very interested in, and they were very good at. They had a very developed communications plan, communications strategy that involved bringing in workers from different ethnic and racial enclaves to all come together and to identify themselves as working people. I mean, it was a huge cultural shift that they were able to accomplish. And the biggest divisions, of course, were racial and ethnic. And this was a really difficult dynamic that they had to deal with, like in packing house, in a lot of steel company towns. The companies had brought in Black workers and workers of other ethnicities specifically for the point of being strikebreakers, right? And so they had instilled this culture of division within a lot of these towns. And part of what the CIO had to do was to bring in all workers and say, you are welcome here. And this was a really difficult task at the time because, again, the AFL, the dominant labor federation in America, the thing that most workers would identify as organized labor, it had explicitly made its mission division, right? They were going to go into the factories and divide everyone as they saw fit. And so this idea that the unions would be for everyone, that they wanted everyone in the unions, and they specifically wanted Black workers and workers of other ethnicities to be in the union. That was the starting point of CIO organizing. And to go back to the communist influence, it helped that a lot of communists were involved in the organizing, right? They weren't in the CIO as a kind of organized political presence. In fact, they did a lot to hide their affiliations at certain points. I mean, we can talk about that, the sort of like secretive, quasi-manipulative nature of communists within these new structures. But they were hired by the CIO as kind of cannon fodder, right? Like Lewis would say, like, you're not going to have influence as an organized political faction within the CIO, but just go out there and organize, right? I'm going to hire you, go out there and organize. And it's estimated that of the 200 original steelworker organizers, something like 60 to 80 of them were communists, right? And the communists brought along a firm commitment to racial equality. I mean, more than other left factions, more than even like the progressive visions of the CIO leaders, they were fully committed to racial egalitarianism, and their influence in packing house, their influence in the electrical workers union, their influence in the steel workers organizing, it was pretty evident, right? They understood that you need to have all workers in the union, or you're going to lose. And so that was, especially in its ascendant period, the CIO was really committed to overcoming all those divisions. Now, of course, it would be romantic to say that white and Black workers were going out and having beers after work and whatnot, but it was instilled in them that they needed to work together at the workplace if they were going to win real rights. And that was an accomplishment of the CIO. I mean, in building that culture of unity, it wasn't perfect, right? I mean, this was still Jim Crow America, but it was a huge advance in raising expectations around a new kind of racial egalitarianism. And in a lot of ways, the CIO moment paved the way for the civil rights movement. I mean, oftentimes, many civil rights leaders gained experience through their labor organizing work. Cleveland Robinson, for instance, worked at District 65 and later became, a key figure in the civil rights movement. So there was that experience that was born in the CIO and developing the culture of unity, and then also a certain discontent with its limitations that I think also fueled the civil rights movement later.
I've got two more questions. I could have this conversation with you for hours. It seems like I really appreciate your taking the time. I want to be respectful of your time. So I have two more things that I'm interested in your in you relaying to the audience. I mentioned and we've touched on the fact that the Steelworkers campaign was really was a pretty top-down affair. Can you explain that and how and how that fact has actually affected the study of the Steelworkers campaign? Because there's less literature about organizing in the steel industry than there was in the auto industry, just because it was kind of it was less interesting to the people who would be interested in doing labor history, because a lot of people who are interested in doing labor history are of the left, and so the auto workers campaign is more kind of emblematic of kind of what we would want to see, and I wonder if another part of the reason is just because it was so uninteresting. Like this just kind of happened. There was an agreement between the union leaders and the bosses, and then there you go. The steelworkers were organized, right? So yeah. Talk to us about that story and the ramifications of it, and also, are the paper workers going to be in the story later on in the podcast?
No, unfortunately not. I mean, I do branch out into to tackle that first question. I do branch out into talking about a lot of other unions, but there are so many different ventures of the CIO that I couldn't. I make mention of all of them, but I really only do deep dives on some of them. So I get into. I mean, in later episodes, I get into textiles, packing house, longshoremen. So there are deep dives into the varied CIO unions, but I don't cover them all in the podcast. No. Yeah, I mean, I think that when, like in the 60s, with the development of sort of new left labor history and the desire to privilege a different kind of writing, different kind of study of labor than had previously existed, right? A lot of the labor studies before that had really focused on institutional structures and the development of organized labor at that level. And there was a desire to write bottom up histories of different unions. And auto workers, electrical workers, packing house workers, right? These were like militant bottom up surges that were really exciting to write about. Steel workers, not so much. I mean, and for at least two reasons. One, because of what we just mentioned, the very top down nature of its formation, the fact that Myron Taylor, who was head of U.S. Steel at the time, and sort of a more progressive industrialist, right? He wasn't a Tom Girdler or a Eugene Grace. Like he had a kind of forward looking vision of capitalism, and he understood that what was involved in the New Deal, it wasn't the end of industrial capitalism. It was just a new phase, and one where it behooved the industrialists to play along with organized labor despite their hatred of it. So it was that kind of situation where the industry, or where one particular major player in an industry was just receptive to unionism, and Lewis liked going out to fancy lunches, and so that's how the Steelworkers Organizing Committee won its big victory. The other side of that is a history of real defeat that's not fun to look at. And if there is one real justification for the Steelworkers Organizing Committee to use the company unions, it was to look at the history of steelworker organizing. I mean, just an absolutely brutal affair, a brutal repressive affair. Homestead, 1919. I mean, it's a tragic history, right? I mean, it's the history of brutal repression from the capitalist class. Like and so when they were organizing steel, a lot of the organizers said, look, like we have to go about this very gingerly, because the willingness to send in the guns in this industry, it's intimidating. And so, that strategy of taking over the company unions was actually quite smart, I think. The other part of it is that they're
for it, actually. Famous communist labor organizer William Foster advocated taking over company unions.
Yeah, no, I mean there was in the next episode of the podcast, actually. Wait, Yeah, no, the fourth episode is coming out on this Tuesday. And in that episode, I get into the communists' approach to trade unions over the years, and Toole and Foster's approach there. So I'll get into that in the next episode.
That'll be really interesting for sure.
Yeah, there's a sort of deep dive on the communist influence and just the influence of the left more broadly, looking at just their relationship to the CIO, both salutary and its limitations. But the other part of that, the reason why there wasn't a ton of writing about the steel industry is because there was also this massive defeat, which is the subject of the fifth episode of the podcast, in Little Steel, summer of 1937, Memorial Day Massacre. It was a massive effort, and I think that some would fault certain elements of the organizing. But for the most part, again, given the role of energetic communists in organizing and being committed to a kind of militant disruption that was effective in a lot of ways during the CIO moment, the state finally threw its hands up. Right, FDR famously declares a plague on both your houses in the Little Steel strike. And there's basically a return to violent, bloody repression at Little Steel, and they lose. And yes, Little Steel is eventually organized with the war, but it was a dramatic illustration of the limits of the New Deal order. Right, FDR was a friend to labor in some ways, but a very limited friend. And Little Steel was. There's a great book by the law professor Ahmed White about Little Steel, trying to recapture some of what the meaning was there. But at the time, it wasn't sexy to write about. It was a radical display of militancy that got absolutely crushed. So there's that as well in the steel industry, right? There's all these reasons why I think new left historians would avoid it. But I think it's a really important part of the story, and we shouldn't turn away from the elements of history that we don't necessarily find romanticizable.
Well, as you continue some of your work outside of this podcast, or maybe in a future installment of the podcast, I would encourage reading into the history of the paper workers. Peter Kellman has a really good book about it. Julius Getman has a good book about a paper strike in 1987 and 88, the betrayal of Local 14. That was really good. Dives into some of the history there, and I found in your description of the steelworkers a lot of similarities in the paper workers, and so like I said, it's interesting that those two unions merged given their similar history. And so to wrap up, I guess I think that a big reason for your podcast is to give. What can we learn from it today? We are in a moment, right, for labor, and there are kind of debates about how much of a movement it is at this point, or how much labor is on the move as we were going on 100 years ago. We have seen another year of decline in union density, but there are still some promising signs. And so what are the lessons for people in the labor movement to take from the CIO, and what are some lessons that people on the left can take from the communists' experience in the CIO? And maybe on that latter question, you can give us some teasers for the next episode.
Yeah, and the final episode of the podcast, there's going to be 9 episodes, I think, in all. And the final episode is strictly devoted to lessons. So I asked all of the labor historians I talked to, what is the significance of the CIO moment for today? As you can imagine, they had a lot to say about that question. And so I'm devoting an entire episode basically to that.
Right. And so I just want you to distill that into 2 or 3 minutes.
So 2 minutes. Okay. Easy question. Yeah. So, people draw different lessons from the CIO moment. I think that there's a lot going for the idea that the political economic context of the 30s is so different from the present that it's really difficult to port lessons. But I think it's possible. I think it just takes some work and understanding it, like what were the root motivations and root structural issues at play there. And I guess I would emphasize two things, again, just sort of knowing we only have a few minutes. The first has to do with the context, and I don't think we're anywhere close to the kind of economic precarity of the Great Depression. And so this idea that that capitalism has been delegitimated in some way, it might be true for certain segments of the left, but it's not true for the American public as a whole. And so we're not in that kind of ripe economic condition for this labor upsurge. I would say though that that we're in a great political juncture, and I know you all just did a section about Shawn Fain's endorsement of Biden. There's reasons to be very appreciative of what's happening at the NLRB right now, right? As like horrible as what the Biden administration is doing in general and what sort of takes the news headlines right now.
Right.
A receptive, non-hostile NLRB is a huge boon to the labor movement, and you have to sort of appreciate that for what it is. And so, in 2024, if Biden is not elected, people like Jennifer Abruzzo are going to be very quickly removed from their posts. So that's something to keep in mind, right? It's not just the economic conditions, it's a certain political willingness to not necessarily support organized labor, because you can't really ever expect the government to be on the side of workers, but at least not to send in the guns and and be on the side of the corporations. That kind of at least neutrality is really important. And it's it's a story of American labor history. Like it's impossible for workers to win if they don't at least have a neutralization of that typical government corporate alliance. So that's one, I think, key thing. And it's one reason to be very appreciative of the kind of NLRB that we have right now, even despite the fact that, there's other atrocities being committed by the administration. That's one thing. The second thing, and I would say this is the most important thing for organized labor right now, is that without renewing some kind of strategic disruption, it's going to be really difficult to gain back power and to force the kind of legal changes that we would need in order to, pass something like the PRO Act or just have a new legal regime for labor in this country. Again, with the sit-down strike, part of the calculus there was that they were going to do something illegal so as to shift national discourse around labor law in their favor, right? I mean, it was directly to organize those employers, but it was also to say, this disruption, it's going to go on provided this legal regime is in place. And it worked, right? And it was, you could again say that it was a containment of radical energies, but the grand bargain paid off. And I think that it's going to be really difficult for labor to do something similar today without engaging in that militant disruption, right? Not just walking off the job, not just engaging in these big strike actions, but to figure out what the strategic choke points in the contemporary deindustrialized logistical economy are, to seize them and to stop production and distribution until unions are recognized and labor gains power. Without that kind of militant disruption, which will bring on a kind of state repression that we haven't seen for a few generations, without that, it's going to be really difficult, I think, to turn the ship around.
Benjamin Fong, I appreciate your time this morning. You teach at Arizona State University. You've got a recent article out in Catalyst, How Can Workers Organize Against Capital Today, where you touch on some of those things. The podcast is called Organize the Unorganized. You can find that pretty much wherever podcasts are found, right?
Yep, it's on Jackman Radio. There's also a SoundCloud page, soundcloud.com/organize the unorganized.
All right. Anything else you want to leave the audience with before we let you go?
No, just enjoy the podcast. You don't have to listen to much of my monotone voice. It's mostly labor historians and experts talking. And again, like you said at the beginning, a lot of fun songs and archival clips.
All right. Appreciate it, Ben. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you.
All right, folks. There you go. Yeah, check it out.
Definitely do check it out. I can tell there's a lot of work put into it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just want to say that right off the bat. So I really appreciate Benjamin and the entire team behind it. It's important. It's important that it gets out there, and particularly in this time. You know, there's a lot of us out here who are trying to revitalize this labor movement. So, of course, we want to look back at when it was working, or at least appeared to be working, and when we had momentum and were winning as a working class. So we got to bring back that 1930s people power.
There you go. Absolutely. So 844-899 TVLR 844-899-8857 if you want to give us a call. We got one more segment and then we'll get out of here if we don't get any calls. The last thing is that there is more and more controversy about Shawn O'Brien's like continuous meetings with Donald Trump. I think they've had 2, and now there's going to be a third on the 31st of next week. And for this one, there were apparently whispers of some General Executive Board members, or at least one, saying that they were not going to be attending this meeting with Donald Trump. I don't know the status of attendance at the other meetings with Donald Trump, not sure. But apparently Shawn O'Brien sent a memo to all members of the General Executive Board saying that it was mandatory for them to come. And this really rankled the feathers of John Palmer. He is a vice president at large on the General Executive Board for the Teamsters International Union. He is a TDU leader, a longtime TDU leader. He has not been afraid of controversy. One of the more, I think one of the more militant leaders of the TDU. And so he responded with his own letter about to Shawn O'Brien, and that has been made public. And that is, and so here's a little snippet of what he said. He said that I write in response to your memo dated January 24th, 2024, demanding that I attend a GEB meeting for the purpose of hearing from former President Donald J. Trump, who has been indicted on 91 felony charges. He is a known union buster, scab, and insurrectionist. I refuse to attend that meeting, which violates the clear language of the international Constitution. And so here's where he quotes from the Constitution, where he makes his constitutional case against the meeting with Donald Trump. He says, in accordance with Article 2, Section 3, Paragraph A, which states the following, quote, no person who knowingly associates, as that term has been defined in prior decisions or disciplinary charges under Article 19, no person who knowingly associates with any member or associate of organized crime families or other criminal groups, or who actively advocates the overthrow of a federal, state, or provincial government by force or violence. Or, so there's this one type of person, right? This person who associates with members or associates of organized crime families or people who want to overthrow the government. Or people who are actually members of these groups, or is a member of any party or group and knows of and actively its purpose to overthrow a federal, state, or provincial government by force or violence shall be allowed to hold membership in the International Union or any of its subordinate bodies. So there's actually a pretty broad prohibition here, not only against being a member of an insurrectionary group or being an insurrectionist yourself, but also associating with such a person. Associating with such a person or group under Palmer's reading of the International Constitution of the Teamsters could be subject for not only discipline, but expulsion from the Teamsters. So that's a very, very strong, very strong charge there from Palmer. A very strong response to O'Brien's demand that Palmer and other GEB members attend this meeting with Trump. And so in his letter, Palmer continues, given this language and the appalling record of Trump appointing union busters to the Department of Labor, NLRB, and United States Postal Service, his scamming of an IATSE picket line, and his refusal to act on the Butch-Lewis Act on behalf of tens of thousands of pensioners across America, this meeting should not occur. Your private meeting with Trump, accompanied by the widely circulated thumbs-up photo, appears as a tacit endorsement while it leaves the membership out of the loop. This private backdoor decision will divide the union and weaken it at a time when we need to fight corporate America and their union busters. During the UAW strike, he chose to meet with non-union workers and attacked the UAW and its leadership. Joe Biden went to the picket line. I will be more than happy to meet with Joe Biden on this date and echo the sentiments of UAW President Shawn Fain in his full-throated endorsement of President Joe Biden. As a United States Army veteran, I cannot support a draft dodger and traitor who deliberately undermines the Constitution of the United States. We should never entertain dialogue with a candidate with such an anti-union record. Finally, you, sir, do not have the constitutional authority to, quote, require that I participate in a meeting with this reprehensible individual any more than you could, quote, require that I meet with an organized crime figure. I look forward to meeting President Biden in the afternoon of the 31st. So, yeah, I mean, very strong language there from Palmer, and you know, I mean, a pretty strong constitutional case against the meeting with Trump as well. So, like I said, that continues to be a controversy online amongst Teamsters and people in the labor movement that are on the left, and so we'll continue to keep an eye on it. And it's just, I mean, you know, I think that most of the most common understanding is that all of these meetings by Shawn Fain with President Trump are performative. I think that most people do not believe that Sean O'Brien will endorse Donald Trump, because such a thing would be unthinkable, especially after, you know, Palmer mentions the Butch-Lewis Act. The Butch-Lewis Act saved several union pension funds with $81 billion, and the biggest single beneficiary of it was the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, right? So it's kind of unthinkable that the Teamsters do anything other than endorse Joe Biden. And yet, O'Brien continues to make a show of these meetings with Trump. And so it's unclear to what end he continues to do this. You know, I mean, even, you know, I think that the case becomes less strong the more often you meet with him, right? You know, I mean, the strongest case that O'Brien has is for the first meeting, right? And you can say, like, okay, I did the meeting, and what do you know? He's bad, right? But the more he does that, the weaker his case gets, that this is just in pursuit of, you know, fairness and vetting and all this stuff, especially when you consider that Trump has been president before and we have a record that we can just look at instead of interviewing him and talking to him. And so, you know, we'll continue to keep an eye on this and see what happens, but I mean, it would just be kind of appalling if they actually do endorse Trump. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. Do you have any thoughts on that, Adam?
Well, I want to point out, Jose in the chat mentioned that Teamsters Mobilize have a petition out about this issue. So, you know, there's a lot of conversation going on among members. You know, Jose was asking about TDU, and, you know, he doesn't believe TDU will say anything about it. It will be interesting to see,
especially with TDU having a prominent leader now speaking out about it. I think the pressure is with Palmer's statement being made public. I think you would think the pressure would be building among TDU members to come out with some sort of statement about this, but I don't know.
Right. And, you know, it's tough, right? It's a tough situation when there's disagreements within your own union, right? And it can be difficult to maintain relationships, right? When you're dealing with those kind of disagreements.
Right.
Let's see, Scott in the chat says, I don't think labor should be political. However, I do think we should support people who support workers. And I get that. You know, I understand that issue. I also see, I see different sides to that, really. In some senses, the ways that our unions are political is not necessarily very effective.
Right.
So me personally, I'm not a big fan of, you know, the large amounts of money that are just kind of dumped into the hands of Democratic candidates. I just don't think that's a very effective use of funds.
Right.
And I don't know that that has proven to get us a whole lot of results.
Right.
Especially given the quality of some of these candidates, the quality of some of the campaigns. Yeah. So I think there's a lot you could discuss about how political our unions are, like how they engage in that politics.
Right.
Should your union, never work with a Republican, right? That's something that's going to come up. And I think it certainly depends on the circumstances, right? You have to look at where are they on our issues. In the case of Trump, like, it's very obvious where he is on the issues. So, you don't have to guess at that. At the end of the day, like, politics is a reflection of what's happening in our society. And so, whether you care about politics cares about you, and it's happening to you. And, so that's why I think it's important that we be engaged in it. It's just, how we do that is up for debate, of course.
Right. Will in the chat makes a good point, and basically I was gonna say this on union shouldn't be political. Everything is politics, and trade unionists need to be talking about issues inside of work and outside in the political world, and that's exactly. I think that's exactly right. I think, Adam, that the way that unions participate in politics is sometimes destructive or at least not helpful, but that unions participate in politics,
right,
I think is good, because the justification for unionism is basically that workers should have more control. And so all unions getting involved in politics is expanding the quest for worker control into the civil, social, and political realm outside of the workplace. And I think that in and of itself, for workers to have more power and influence in the civil, social, and political world would be an unmitigated good. How our unions currently go about practicing politics, that is something that I am more critical of. But just should unions do politics? The answer to that question, I think, is obviously yes.
I think so too. Yeah. Because it's just your influence is going to be limited outside of that, and ultimately, I think the long-term goal here should be building a working class movement and building our power as working class people, and that should be the direction of your politics. Like, is it aimed in that direction? Is it serving that ultimate goal to build a working class movement like we had in the 1930s?
Right.
And to have that kind of power where we can actually win real demands. I think should be the end goal here. So anyway, that's my thoughts about it. I know there's a lot of internal debates that folks in the Teamsters are going to have about this approach and, what they ultimately do. In terms of the endorsement of Biden, I feel a lot like Notary. Some comments we got at the very beginning of the episode that, kind of saw it coming eventually. It's kind of, not only is it sort of expected, it is ultimately, the least bad choice probably on the table.
Right.
The timing of it, the dissonance, of calling for a ceasefire and then turning around and endorsing, that's difficult. Absolutely. And I felt the same way at the AFL-CIO MLK conference, and I talked about that a week or two ago. Here was all this, rousing rhetoric about civil rights and human rights and the connection to labor rights and the legacy of Dr. King, and not a word about Palestine, and not a word about the 26,000 people who are dead, who've been killed. And so, yeah, it's really tough. It's really tough. But William had a comment that capitalism and democracy don't mix. We should never work with any party that represents capitalism and the bosses. And I'm sensitive to that. I agree with the first part, that a capitalist society is never going to be a truly democratic society because of the inherent inequality of power.
Right.
In terms of, do we work with parties? I really struggle with that a lot, and I don't know that there is a right answer all the time, necessarily. I think it may depend on the situation and whether it's a local, state, national level, where you're at, where your power lies, like what kind of influence you bring to bear. So I think that's a complicated one, but I'm definitely sympathetic to that, and that's really my gut instinct, is that, they're not for us. Like, the Democratic Party is not a working class party, right? And so whether you endorse Biden as your tactical decision for 2024, whether you work with them on certain issues, I think is a different story, right? Like, I'm willing to work with Republicans if they're willing to do something good for workers, right? If a Republican in the legislature is willing to sponsor a bill that helps working people, well, hell yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Still going to disagree with, 99% of everything else you do. But if we can accomplish something that moves the ball down the field and actually, does provide material impacts for working people, I'm all about that.
Right.
And so to the extent that we can get those kind of wins from Democrats, that's great. But yeah, I just don't necessarily, I don't know. I certainly have no loyalty to the Democratic Party. Nor do I think working people should, because the Democratic Party has no loyalty to working people. If we use them to our advantage, then great. Know that they're always trying to use us to their advantage.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's the relationship. Just kind of checking out some of the comments here as we wrap up. JC Luna says, should unions do politics? In some ways, you're correct. Regarding presidential elections, specifically, the popular vote has no say in who gets in office. It's the Electoral College. Our voice is null. As an Alabamian, I can only say that I 100% feel that, because my vote will not matter. Whether I write in Nick Saban, whether I vote for Trump or Biden, whether Cornel West or a Green Party candidate's on the ballot, it literally will make no difference what I do in November. And so, honestly...
But the UAW's endorsement matters, especially because they have a lot of weight in swing states like Michigan.
Yes, I agree. I 100% agree. So, like, there's also something, to add to the dynamic is, like, there's your personal choice, and then there's, like, how you feel about the strategy of organizations and larger forces, and what other people should do. And of course, people love to tell other people what they should do when it comes to voting. And I am very, cynical about that because, like a lot of folks on the left, I've experienced people blaming me for Trump in 2016, or, that really is bizarre because I live in Alabama and Trump won Alabama by over 20 points. So yeah, for a lot of people, I won't say most, but a lot of people in this country, their personal choice in November will mean very little. And so should you go vote? Yeah, I say go vote, especially if it won't take you much time, which it probably won't. If you can vote, you should go vote. But at the end of the day, like, there's so much more we should be doing and organizing in the workplace, building community coalitions, building our power inside and outside the workplace, expanding our networks, educating each other, agitating and organizing. Like, that's really, where we should direct most of our energy, and just engage in electoral politics on a, tactical basis. But anyway, that's about all I want to say on electoral politics for a while, because I really don't care about it that much, frankly.
We do have we've got one call, and we're coming up on the end of the show, so we'll make this one quick. And I think I know who this is from a 256 area code. Joe, what's on your mind?
Hey, Jacob.
Hey, Joe.
Shawn O'Brien, I don't understand what his thinking is by meeting with Donald Trump. You hit the nail on the head when you say that he had a 4-year term. We can see where he stands, and to use the excuse of vetting a candidate just don't make sense to me. But that ain't really what I wanted to talk about, and this will be quick. I just wanted to mention the execution in Alabama this week. And Meemaw Ivy's statement made after the execution was, we have, I ain't quoting her, but her statement was, we've carried out a humane execution. Now, does them two words go together?
Right.
There's no such thing as a humane execution. She had been better served just to say that Alabama carried out an execution. And then Steve Marshall weighed in on it, defending it, and he basically wanted to say that the family got justice in the matter. And maybe true enough, but you got to let the family say whether that is true or not. Not a statement from the Attorney General, but the thing I find ironic about it, the family was complicit with the murder in the first place. The preacher husband hired the hitman that killed his wife. So don't weigh the family in with that situation when the family created in the first place. But that's all I got to say. Y'all have a good day.
Hey, appreciate you, Joe. And I'm glad you brought that up. For those of you outside Alabama who may not be aware, the state of Alabama carried out an experimental execution this week. They used nitrogen gas, which had never been used to execute people before in this country. I'm not sure if any other country has ever done it. It has been denounced by the United Nations and many other countries as well. It's yet another disgrace for Alabama. Last thing on the comments, there's a lot of great discussion today. I really appreciate that. JC Luna talks about building infrastructure and building cooperatives, and I totally agree with that. I think you have to operate on as many fronts as possible, and so we need people building co-ops and building community land trust and getting land and resources into the hands of regular everyday people. We need people unionizing in the workplace. We do need people working in policy spaces and in political spaces. We need people organizing in the community and organizing tenants, right, and students everywhere. We have to be organizing everywhere. Right. And I think some people make the mistake of focusing entirely on politics. And then, like, our natural reaction among some of us is to say, well, to hell with all of that, right, and this have nothing to do with it. But I just say let's organize everywhere, and wherever you fit in, wherever you have talents, wherever you feel comfortable and you're passionate, at the end of the day, there's stuff that every one of us can do to try to make this world a better place and try to build a working class movement that can really transform things, because we need it. We're you mentioned earlier you're concerned about the state of the country. I think, anyone paying attention is concerned. And should be concerned.
I was going to call back to that, talking about the execution, because much like the rhetoric around immigration has been getting worse and more, wicked and xenophobic,
it's more
and all of this, and bloodthirsty. Yeah, the rhetoric around the execution was the same. I think the only proper. I grew up in a conservative household, and so I can still, in a lot of ways, see how people believe certain things, and I can understand how a person would believe that for justice to happen, it would be necessary to carry out an execution. I no longer agree with that, obviously. I think that's wrong, but I understand that there are people that have that perspective, But the people that I grew up around with that perspective, it was always somber, and it was not gleeful and bloodthirsty. To the extent that I had conversations with people about the death penalty, it was this is a difficult thing that we have to do to carry out justice and should be treated thusly, right? And it is absolutely concerning to me, again, for the state of the country and for the state of the world, that the bloodthirsty rhetoric is pervading so many avenues of our political discourse, as it relates to immigration, and then as it relates to the execution of Kenny Smith with an experimental with a new and experimental form of execution that is, by witness accounts, the most violent execution in decades in the state of Alabama. And the rhetoric is just really, it's been really just.
It's disturbing.
It's
been disturbing, and and a lot of it's coming from self-professed pro-life Christians,
right?
And particularly down here in Alabama. I can't say what's happening in California. Those of you out that way, but down here, for sure, it's a lot of pro-life Christians, people who call themselves that, and it's sickening. It really is, and there's a hatred and bigotry that is out there, and we have to combat that. I mean, solidarity is the only way we combat bigotry and the hatred that's out there. That's the only way we get through it is we try to have solidarity with one another and look out for one another, recognize that we're not better than anybody else, no one else is better than us, like that's and we have to build a mass working class movement and include everybody and not allow ourselves to be divided by, nationality or ethnicity, immigration status, gender, sexuality, all these other ways in which, the bosses and the politicians try to divide us. And unfortunately, there's a lot of folks out there, who fall into this and who buy into this crap. And then there's the billions of dollars that are spent, pumping this propaganda out to people, and it works on some of them. We've got people out there who are consuming this stuff for hours and hours and hours a day, just hearing vile stuff about their fellow human beings. I mean, I think it's a spiritual and moral crisis. Truthfully, and I am a very materialist oriented kind of guy and try to think about politics from that perspective, but there is something just deeper even than that, I think, going on. And so not to end on that somber note, the hopeful thing is I think there are so many instances of people building people power, and it's happening all over, and I think the more we do that, the more we come together, the more we fight for our common interest and start to win for each other, I think that really is going to make a difference. And like Scott says in the chat, solidarity leads to more empathy, and I 100% agree with that.
And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the show. Appreciate everybody listening. Please like the stream on your way out. If you're listening to us wherever you get your podcasts, give us a 5-star rating, especially if you're on Apple Podcasts. We got to get those numbers up for sure. TVLR.fm/donate. You can make a one-time or recurring donation there. Recurring donations really help with the sustainability of the program. If you're a member of a union, then please do think about getting your local or international to sponsor the show. We could not do this without our union sponsors, even though listener donations make up the largest single source of funding. Union sponsors are the vast majority of where our funding comes from
Right.
for this program, and so it is absolutely necessary. So if you're a member of a union, please do think about getting your local to sponsor the show, or your international. Appreciate everybody's time.
Yeah. Anything you do, we really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Liking, sharing, subscribing, donating, all of that. It means a lot. We're just a couple union dudes out here trying to preach solidarity. We don't have all the answers, but that's the answer we got. So really appreciate everybody's support, and just let's keep on building people power.
844-899-TVLR if you want to leave us a voicemail. See you next week.